Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Detlev Claussen's Theodor W. Adorno, One Last Genius. Chapter 2 is titled The House in Schöne Aussicht, a Frankfurt Childhood around 1900. And it starts with a quote, "The magical power to manipulate childhood is the strength of the weak." Quote. Theodor W. Adorno. In the George Hofmannsthal Correspondence, 1891 to 1906. It's weird. I don't know those dates seem strange. If that's a letter from Adorno. But anyway, one glance at the street known as Schöne Aussicht is enough to see that it has changed. This change is not simply due to the bombing of Frankfurt Old Town during the Second World War, as one is seduced into believing by what one has seen and heard. Admittedly, what has survived includes all sorts of things that lie beneath the earth's surface. The section of the River Main embankment in Frankfurt, where Adorno's great-grandfather established his wine merchant's business under the name Bernhard Wiesengrund in 1864, had been built up in 1792 and is still furrowed by deep cellar vaults which provided outstanding storage facilities for wine at the time. A local proverb testifies to this tradition, quote, "In Frankfurt there is more wine in the cellars than water in the wells," unquote. The old blue files of the Frankfurt City Council contain a petition to the Senate in 1867 in which Bernhard Wiesengrund applied for permission to transfer his business to Frankfurt am Main from Dettelbach in Lower Franconia, where it had been established in 1822. The quote, "Register of Old Frankfurt Companies" of 1926 recorded the centenary celebrations of the export-import business of Bernhard Wiesengrund on the 25th of July, 1922. The firm's address, Schöne Aussicht 7, had remained unchanged since 1864. A file card in the Frankfurt tax office notes that the last owner of the business was Adorno's father, Oscar Alexander Wiesengrund, who had been born in 1870. It bears a stamp with the laconic inscription, quote, "Business ceased, 31/12/38. Registered on 11/4/39. So I guess that's what? December, ceased being in business on the 31st of December, 1938, and registered on the 11th of April, 1939. If we look back from the middle of the 20th century, the picture of Schöne Aussicht clouds over. As early as the onset of the Nazi period, Adorno's friend Walter Benjamin attempted to capture the, quote, "decline of the bourgeoisie," and, quote, in two projects that Adorno greeted enthusiastically. The volume of letters titled Deutsche Menschen, German Men and Women, and the autobiographical sketch Berliner Kindheit 1900, Berlin Childhood around 1900. On the 7th of November 1936, Adorno wrote from Oxford to Benjamin, who was in Paris, quote, "Your book on, quote, Germans has indeed been a great delight to me. I read it immediately after it arrived, from the first sentence to the last throughout the night. The expression of grief which the book exudes seems remarkably close to that of the Berlin childhood, the composition of which may indeed have coincided in time with making the selection of the letters and writings the introduction to them. If the earlier piece reproduced images of a life which a certain class forbade itself to see without revealing any other life, so the perspective you cast on these letters reproduces, as it were, the very same process of concealment in objective form, where the childhood, the book, or the project, had testified to its subjective form." End quote. Adorno to Walter Benjamin. What could have induced Benjamin, who was proud of, quote, never using the word, quote, "I," end quote, in his published works, to write a memoir of childhood, and what could have led Adorno, who often appears in their correspondence as Benjamin's implacable literary conscience, to put aside all scruples about autobiography? Footnote. See Walter Benjamin, A Berlin Chronicle, in the book One-Way Street and Other Writings, translated by Edmund Jeffcott and Kingsley Shorter, 1979. To both, looking back from exile, childhood appeared a utopia, an age-old utopian motif, quote, that appears to everyone in their childhood and where no one ever was, home, unquote. Ernst Bloch. This was the way it was expressed by a third person, one with whom the two often engaged in discussions, Ernst Bloch, in the book The Principle of Hope. When asked by the German Postal Workers magazine in 1962, "Why have you returned?" Adorno had no qualms about replying, quote, "I simply wanted to return to where I spent my childhood, and ultimately I acted from my own feeling that what we realize in life is little more than the attempt to recover one's childhood in a different form. I did not underestimate the risk and the difficulty of my decision, but I have not rued it to this day, precisely because my work in Germany is essentially critical in character. And because I believe that I make so few concessions to the dominant spirit here, I may perhaps be allowed to express these ideas without exposing myself to accusations of pusillanimity or sentimentality," end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Adorno's essay on Heine of 1956 varies the themes of homelessness. Quote, Heine's stereotypical theme, unrequited love, is an image for homelessness, and the poetry devoted to it is an attempt to draw estrangement itself into the sphere of intimate experience. Now that the destiny which Heine sensed has been fulfilled literally, however, the homelessness has also become everyone's homelessness. All human beings have been as badly injured in their beings and their language as Heine the outcast was. His words stand in for their words. There is no longer any homeland other than a world in which no one would be cast out anymore, the world of a genuinely emancipated humanity. That the wound that is Heine will heal only in a society that has achieved reconciliation, end quote. And that's from the article Heine the Wound, which is available in Notes to Literature, edited by Rolf Tiedemann, translated by Sherry Weber Nicholson, Volume 1, 1991. End footnote. Adorno's reply to this deceptively straightforward question is linked to a second question that he responded to in a broadcast on German radio that same year. Quote, what is German? The text, which he thought well enough of to include in his last collection of essays in June 1969, the volume titled Catchwords, contains the same, perhaps even more highly polished formulations that he had used in the Postal Workers magazine to describe the childhood, quote, in which what is specific to me is imparted down to its innermost essence, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. That's from On the Question, What is German?, available in the book Critical Models, translated by Henry W. Pickford in 1983. End footnote. There is an attempt at clarification in the notes he wrote after his return from exile, which were only published posthumously in 2003. These notes, which were conceived as a continuation of Minima Moralia, contain a statement from April 1960 in Notebook F, in which he says, quote, it is a wholly irreparable disaster that in Germany everything connected in any way at all with a nearby happiness, with home, has been taken over by the reactionary camp, by Philistinism, by cliquishness, by the self-righteousness of the narrow-minded, by the heart-warmingly sentimental, by nationalism and ultimately fascism. One cannot enjoy so much as an old nook or cranny without feeling shame or a sense of guilt. This means the loss of something that should have been preserved for the progressive cause. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Adorno had planned a sequel to Minima Moralia after his return to Germany. It was to be called Graeculus, Ralph Tiedemann published a selection in the Frankfurter Adorno Blätter number 8 in 2003. What is specific to Adorno, however, cannot be identified simply by attributing to him certain characteristics such as, quote, German, or, quote, Jewish, or, quote, bourgeois, terms that mainly trigger stereotyped associations. A Frankfurt childhood around 1900 was as much influenced by the long bourgeois century as by the structural changes in the city. The secular bourgeoisification of the Jews in Germany, or indeed the transformation of the German bourgeoisie itself, a topic explored by Thomas Mann in his novel Buddenbrooks, which appeared in 1901. Can we perhaps speak of Frankfurt as a spiritual form of life as Mann spoke of Lübeck? Certainly. Like Lübeck, Frankfurt has its own marzipan in the shape of the Bettmännchen, which, like its wine, raises sensuous pleasure to the level of a basic right. If we are mindful of Goethe's saying about the difference it makes to be born 10 years later, we shall have to ask why Adorno's childhood is so different from that of his considerably older friend and mentor, Siegfried Kracauer. Kracauer, who had been born in Frankfurt in 1889, produced a novel, Ginster, von ihm selbst geschrieben, which contains an unmistakable picture of Frankfurt. Quote, Ginster came from F, a large town with a long history on a river, set against a low range of hills. Like other towns, it made use of its past to stimulate tourism. Imperial coronations, international congresses, and a federal shooting festival took place within its walls, which have long since been replaced by public parks. A monument has been erected to the garden designer. There are Christian and Jewish families that can trace their roots back to their ancestors. Even families of humble origin have produced banking firms with connections in Paris, London, or New York. Centers of worship are separated only geographically from the stock exchange. The climate is temperate. People who, unlike Ginster, do not live in Westend are of no importance. Since he had grown up in F, he knew even less about the town than about the towns he had never been to. End quote. Siegfried Kracauer, Ginster, von ihm selbst geschrieben, 1973. Or at least that's when it's published. Kracauer deliberately chose a tone free of the sentimentality that threatens to accompany every mention of a hometown. An additional factor was that in the mid-1920s, a novelist's style was supposed to demonstrate a clean break with that of the 20th century, which had attempted as it drew to a close. An additional factor was that in the mid-1920s, a novelist's style was supposed to demonstrate a clean break with that of the 19th century, which had attempted, as it grew to a close, to invent a tradition for itself. In the 1920s, after the First Great War, the need was felt to tart up Frankfurt's past with its stone witnesses and especially its decaying old town. The appearance of the relative timelessness that determines the tone of the opening of Kracauer's novel underscores the provinciality of Frankfurt in a way that even then amounted to a provocation to the local patriotism of the townsfolk. The long shadow tradition favored a cultural climate that turned the town into a breeding ground for nostalgia. The predominance of a tradition that had ceased to have any validity and that threatened to subside into the eternal recurrence of mediocrity had, with a time lapse of 20 years, summoned the forces of modernity to sweep away the cobwebs of an idealized past. For the fact was that the 19th century had brought continuous progress to Frankfurt as part of the general industrialization of Germany. Until the 1870s, the patriarchal authorities of the town produced a dogged resistance to the process of industrialization and strove to perpetuate and even expand the role of the ancient imperial city as a center of trade and luxury. Old prints of Schöne Aussicht provide evidence of an elegant ambiance, a grand bourgeois environment of a pre-industrial kind, one suitable for a demanding man of private means like Arthur Schopenhauer, who moved there before the 1848 revolution and lived there until his death in 1860. The row of white neoclassical buildings with an expansive view on the edge of the medieval town is praised in the accounts of knowledgeable travelers during the first half of the 19th century, and is contrasted with the more forbidding Rhineland fortress towns of Mainz and Koblenz. The development of Frankfurt, however, was hampered by the political restorations that followed the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and the failure of the Revolution in 1848. The old Frankfurt Fair had long since lost its significance. In the mid-1830s, the Frankfurt wine trade, traditionally one of the most successful businesses in town, collapsed. Both before and after the 1848 revolution, the general mood in the Free City tended more toward pessimism than toward the feeling of a progressive 19th century metropolis. The status of a free city proved to be more of a hurdle to bourgeois progress than the city walls, which had been raised in 1806. The Frankfurt upper class did not find it easy to come to terms with change. After Bismarck's unification of Germany by force from above, Frankfurt am Main was unable to preserve its autonomy as an independent city-state. The Frankfurt upper class did not find it easy to come to terms with change. After Bismarck's unification by force from above, Frankfurt am Main was unable to preserve its autonomy as an independent city-state. The Austro-Prussian dualism that had also been a determining factor in public opinion in Frankfurt was resolved by force of arms in favor of Prussia in 1866. A few Frankfurt patricians, but also some long-established Jews, resolutely refused to become Prussians. A coincidental but spectacular event was widely interpreted as the visible end of Old Frankfurt as the center of the German Empire. During the night before the visit of the King of Prussia on the 15th of August 1865, Frankfurt Cathedral was destroyed by fire. The town resolved to rebuild it in Neo-Gothic style, a monument to the fashion for historicist architecture. The unification of Germany, belated as it was in comparison to the Western European nations, brought new economic prospects after 1866, when Bernhard Wiesengrund, Theodor W. Adorno's forebear, moved his wine and spirits business down the river Main to Frankfurt from the Franconian town of Detlev. He was looking for a place with a future for his firm and his family, a commercial center with fine prospects on the burgeoning national and international markets. In 1867, as can be seen from the records of the Frankfurt Senate, the freedom of domicile that had recently been introduced and had also been extended to Jews enabled him to acquire the narrow house at Schöne Aussicht 7, together with its cellars. At around the same time, other Wiesengrunds from Detlev came to settle in Frankfurt. The time seemed favorable since the Frankfurt of tradition was in crisis, and the road seemed open for the town to develop into an important German metropolis. Thus the Wiesengrunds did not belong to the established Frankfurt Jewish community, who, like the Rothschilds, could trace their origins to houses in the ghetto, the legendary Judengasse. The French Revolution had put an abrupt end to the ghetto existence of the Frankfurt Jews in 1796, when the Judengasse was demolished by the cannon of General Kleber. But the restoration following the Congress of Vienna had encouraged the Frankfurt Senate to reverse in part the progressive legislation with regard to the Jews that had been introduced by Prince Primate Karl von Dalberg in 1806 with backing from Napoleon. Ludwig Brunner, who, after the founder of the Rothschild dynasty, was undoubtedly the best-known product of the Frankfurt ghetto, never concealed his pride at being a, quote, Juif du Frankfurt. a Jew of Frankfurt. I think that translates that. I don't know how to say it, the word Jew in French, but Juif I know is the word. Oh, Juif. I don't know how you pronounce that word. Let me repeat that sentence. It's probably Juif. I don't know. I have no idea. Ludwig Börne, who, after the founder of the Rothschild dynasty, was undoubtedly the best-known product of the Frankfurt ghetto, never concealed his pride at being a, quote, Juif du Frankfurt, or his contempt for the anti-democratic sentiments of the Frankfurt patricians. The Wiesengrund's move to Frankfurt was part of the secularizing process that might well be called the golden age of Jewish bourgeoisification in Germany. The history of the Wiesengrund firm fits in with the general trend of economic and social development among South German Jews. The founding of the firm in 1822 coincides with the growth in trade following the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The wine trade calls for a combination of local knowledge and a broader national vision. With the opening up of international markets after the ending of the Continental Blockade, Jewish businessmen, who had often enough started out as peddlers, began to open shops and to engage in new branches of trade, such as groceries. Looked at from lower Franconia, the nearest larger market towns were first Würzburg, then Frankfurt, which from around 1830, feeling constricted by the new Prussian-German customs union surrounding it, began to extend feelers beyond the German frontiers in search of new commercial links. The Jews who lived in Lower Franconia were Bavarian subjects who found themselves subjected to periodic pressures after 1815 in the small towns and villages where they had traditionally lived. With the end of the so-called Wars of Liberation, the governments in the German Confederation made efforts to reverse the emancipation of the Jews, which, where it had taken place at all, was very imperfect and was subject to a great number of local variations. Furthermore, there were numerous populist outbreaks of violence, particularly against Jewish merchants. The so-called Hep riots, which first occurred in Würzburg and surrounding area, were an ugly introduction to the period of restoration in 1819. In the succeeding decades, Lower Franconia remained the focus of anti-Jewish agitation. In 1866, in particular, violent anti-Semitic outbursts were reported in this region. What could have seemed more natural for Bernhard Wiesengrund than to distance himself as much as possible from these inhospitable places and seek out the anonymity of a larger commercial center, without, however, moving too far from the wine-producing region he knew so well? In 1867, there was a revival and modified form of a coalition of would-be emancipated Jews and democratic citizens. They included Leopold Zonemann, the founder of the Frankfurter Zeitung, and Friedrich Stulze, a Democrat with a revolutionary past in the pre-1848 period. With the end of Frankfurt's status as a free city, they thought the town had a real opportunity to become a major democratic force in Prussia. The process of modernization, which changed the face of Frankfurt over the next 50 years, established its best landmarks in the Eiserne Steg, Iron Bridge, and the Opera House, the University, and the Palmengarten. The town shifted its center of gravity to the west, increasing its size by swallowing up nearby villages, and in 1888, with its new-built central station, became a major railway junction in the new German Empire. There was something of a time lag, however, before Frankfurt responded to the stimuli of industry, although from 1890 on its mayor, Franz Atticus, promoted industrialization in an almost systematic way. Between 1872 and 1884, the houses in the Judengasse were gradually torn down, since after the abolition of the ghetto in 1811, it had become a sad focus of social deprivation. The year 1895 might be regarded as a turning point. Frankfurt had now become a modern big city, the eighth largest in Germany. This process continued with undiminished force until well into the First World War. Large-scale projects such as the founding of the university and the expansion of the eastern harbor, the Osthafen, were not completed until the outbreak of war. If we look back at the epoch in which the Wiesengrund settled in Frankfurt, we can define it as the decisive phase of the transformation from a traditional agrarian world into a modern industrial society. The change from the old commercial center on the River Main to a modern German metropolis gave rise to a particular synthesis of old and new that resulted in the concrete image of the city in which Adorno was born on the 11th of September 1903. The reform period after 1866 gave birth to the great plans to alter the appearance of the town, but they were the work of a mayor still under the influence of the old Frankfurt senatorial tradition. This was Daniel Heinrich Mumm von Schwarzenstein. He was an adherent of the idea of the, quote, beautiful town that was to be an attraction to affluent outsiders. The Eisernsteg and Palmengarten, both privately financed, were soon built. The Frankfurt Opera House was the scene of a spectacular struggle in which the new forces in society demanded a say in the project that would not be confined to questions of location and cost. A decisive role was played by Leopold Zonemann, who set out to speak for both democratic aspirations and a new social distinctiveness. The rivalry between the modern middle class and the patrician tradition was visible in the personalities involved. The public debates about the Opera House appear confusing to us because the class differences seem to have become blurred. The unresolved nature of this paradoxical modernity in Wilhelminian form is reflected in its architecture. The Opera House is a bombastic revival of the High Renaissance. In the same way, the Neo-Gothic and Neo-Baroque compete with each other to provide the exteriors of both old and new buildings of the period. We can imagine the sights that must have greeted Adorno in 1951 when he responded to the New Year's survey of the Neue Zeitung, which had wanted to know, quote, when would you have most liked to live, end quote. His, quote, almost too earnest, end quote, reply turned into a lengthy meditation. In his response, Adorno defends the idea of wishing, but offers a different defense of the 19th century from the customary one. Quote, the 19th century, which incidentally no longer figures in the replies with the malicious contempt that was customary when people's parents were still around to be feared, and justifiably so. This same 19th century had openly displayed the desire to escape from itself. But what is more characteristic of it than the knightly castles and Renaissance palaces that it bequeathed to its children? End quote. Adorno. Footnote, and this from a piece titled Almost Too Earnest was the title of his response. And it's somewhere in the Adorno archives. The childlike heart of utopia seems to be within one's grasp. The following sentence sounds almost as if it could have come from the pen of Ernst Bloch, quote, but the man who casts his wish into the remote distance is the defeatist of the happiness that lies to hand. One feels ashamed of utopia because there no longer needs to be one, end quote. Adorno. This reflection would have been feeble without the veiled allusion to his own parents. The conflict with one's own bourgeois nature animates the hidden topic of the parental utopia. Gershom Scholem, Walter Benjamin's friend from their time together in their youth in Berlin, describes this in a way that is representative for his entire generation. His narrative has greater conviction because of his early decision to become a Zionist, and thus to dismiss as an illusion the assimilation into the German bourgeoisie to which the parental generation had aspired. Scholem wrote in 1978, quote, looking back, I am even more convinced than I could be in my youth, when I was filled with the passions of protest, that for many people illusion and utopia were hopelessly mixed up together, and that this state of mind anticipated the feeling of happiness at being at home. There was something genuine in this, namely the genuine quality that we must admit is contained in utopia, end quote. Gershom Scholem. In a book or in a piece titled Zur Sozialpsychologie der Juden in Deutschland 1900 bis 1930. This is published in 1978 in Judaica, Volume 4, Frankfurt am Main, 1984. End footnote. The Wiesengrunds arrived in Frankfurt from Detlev at a time of profound demographic change. During the period 1866 to 1910, the town's population increased fivefold while its area merely doubled in size. We can only guess at the social fault lines lying behind the bare figures. In 1913, 87% of the population of Frankfurt was held to have become less well off. Just behind Schöne Aussicht lay the decaying Frankfurt Old Town, where social deprivation had begun to concentrate during the last third of the 19th century. If the Wiesengrunds had been prior immigrants from the agrarian south of Germany, there was now a flood of non-Jewish newcomers from the countryside. The lead of the early migrants soon expressed itself in economic terms. As homeowners who could also muster the 5,000 guilders that were needed to obtain citizenship, the Wiesengrunds belonged to the narrow band of the growing middle class, but they were far from qualifying for inclusion in the ranks of the wealthy according to the census of 1913, namely the 224 millionaires and the 160 multimillionaires who built the villas in the truly upper middle class of West End and later on in the western part of Sachsenhausen. With this growth of industry on the edge of the town and the extension of the eastern docks, the area around Schöne Aussicht became increasingly undesirable as a residential quarter. It seems only logical then for Adorno's father to have moved in 1914 to a house at 19 Seeheimerstrasse in the suburb of Oberrad, which had become part of Frankfurt in 1900. The family had now become well placed in social terms but stayed quite close to the business, which could be reached quickly just by crossing the bridge. Mühlberg, which it was also quite close by, was fast becoming a center of the beverage industry, but remained distinct from the new residential district in Oberrad, where the Frankfurt colors of red and white dominated on the facades of the houses. Paul Arnsberg, who wrote a continuation to the history of Frankfurt's Jews that had been writing by Siegfried Krakauer's uncle, Isidor Krakauer, notes that in 1875 the number of Jews in Frankfurt had reached a record 11.54% of the population. By comparison, the average across the whole empire was 1.2%, and the proportion in Berlin was 4.7%. The Wiesengrunds were among the first of a great wave of immigrants in the 1890s, of whom the Jews formed a minuscule fraction, scarcely visible in the general trend towards urbanization. It was at this time that the much commented on division of the Jews into Ostend and Westend started to become visible, even though the distinction remained superficial. Yeah, like there's at this time, to my understanding, just as there's a lot of migration to the United States, there's also a lot of internal migration within Europe, and that includes Jews from all over Europe, but it also just includes just Europeans being on the move in general. More than a few Jews, and there was and obviously Jews being is an interesting thing, because as opposed to say I don't know, other national groups or other ethnic groups or whatever, however you'd like to conceptualize Jewishness or the state of being a Jew. They're from different corners of they're a diaspora, so their conditions of living have historically been more diverse than say someone say you were Italian or something like that. There would probably be more homogeneity, especially if you were from a particular part of Italy, which a lot of Italian immigrants, for instance, were, the South. There would have been more commonalities, I guess. So I know that that's a thing of Jews that are coming from say Germany versus Jews that are coming from I don't know, fucking Ukraine or something like that. There's a different culture, different history, different infrastructure. The culture's built on different different access to resources and so on. So that's interesting to me. More than a few Jews succeeded in moving to prestigious Westend only by overstretching their resources. Oh, no. Oh, so that's not even wrong. I'm just talking about the wrong thing. Ostend and Westend refers to like parts of the city. It was at this time that the much commented on division of the Jews into Ostend and Westend started to become visible, even though the distinction remained superficial. More than a few Jews succeeded in moving to prestigious Westend only by overstretching their resources. Toward the end of the century, the movement of inner-city Jews, whether through trade or education, tended to lead not so much from east to west as into Nordend and or newly incorporated areas like Bockenheim. The trend among Jews to achieve middle-class status overlapped with the tendency towards secularization, a process that affected not just Jews but society as a whole. The secularizing tendency had serious consequences for Jews, however, because the gradual loosening of religious ties transformed their entire network of relationships. Traditionally, abandoning one's Jewish faith was accompanied by the obnoxious taint of betrayal, of apostasy. This was a hangover from the non-secularized world in which to abandon the solidarity of the persecuted meant joining the ranks of the persecutors of the Jewish people. In the Middle Ages and the early modern age, apostates frequently allowed themselves to be used as crown witnesses against the allegedly sinister customs of Jews. This changed after the secularization process set in after 1815 with the European Wars of Liberation. That led to paradoxical results during the Biedermeier period of the 1820s and 1830s. Non-religious Jews quickly found themselves falling between all available stools. Heine's famous dictum about baptism as the, quote, entry ticket to European culture, end quote, has rarely been correctly understood. Heine's own decision both to undergo baptism in order to circumvent reactionary anti-Jewish legislation in the so-called Vormärz, the period before 1848, and also to make an attempt to disguise his Jewish origins, dismayed both Jews and Christians. The same may be said of Ludwig Berne, who later became the object of Heine's invective. After his disappointments in Frankfurt at the time of the War of Liberation, Berne adopted the Protestant faith without ever renouncing his right to take up the cudgels on behalf of the Jews. And I know nothing about Germany, so I don't know where Frankfurt is in Germany, but I know, like, it's like, what's it, the Rhineland or whatever, that's to the, I guess that's to the west, right? That's in Western Germany, I believe. Maybe I'm wrong. But I know that, like, it's interesting because what I'm thinking about when I'm reading this is about, like, Karl Marx's family upbringing and how his family, his father was Jewish and converted to Protestantism in order to practice law. But I think that kind of Protestantism was like a formal thing, because I think that the Marx family, the kind of like the milieu that like Marx grew up in, was like a very like pretty pro-French, like pro-Republican, like part of German society, and not just as Jews, but I think like I think Trier. I'm not sure, but I had it in my head that from reading Michael Heinrich's biography that Trier was kind of like liberal, or like kind of like it had like a lot of people who were like interested in like secularism and republicanism and liberalism and democracy, those kinds of things, as opposed to being like real like traditionalist or hierarchical or concerned with traditional hierarchies of some kind. That's at least my understanding. So it's kind of interesting, like this kind of like thing of like, actually I don't even know what I was going to say, but that's just what's making me think of right now. The granting of equal rights to Jews did not become a reality until the belated unification of the German Empire in 1871. Once the Judengasse had disappeared physically from the map of Frankfurt in the 1870s, the streets and squares in the neighborhood were renamed. In 1885, the Frankfurt Town Council resolved to rename the former Judengasse Bernestrasse, while the Judenmarkt was transformed into, quote, Bernaplatz. These changes were in tune with the advances made by the Jewish middle classes in the second half of the 19th century. Monuments were erected posthumously to men whose ideas had been bitterly contested during their lifetime. Yet it was not until the 13th of December 1913 in Friedberger Park in Frankfurt that Mayor Georg Voigt, I can't remember, never pronounce this name right, Foigt, Voigt, was able to unveil the first monument in Germany to Heinrich Heine. In 1956, Adorno gave a talk, quote, Heine the Wound, on West German radio. It was only through the historical experience of mass murder and expulsion, he suggested, that Heine's, quote, vision of victimhood, and, quote, had been given its edge. Adorno locates that vision in one of Heine's poems in the cycle titled The Return Home, Die Heimkehr, adding that it had lost its contours in the Heine cult of the term of the 20th century. Quote, Heine the Wound, and, quote, sounds highly ambiguous and is meant to do so. The elegant formulations of the final version of the essay obscure the origins of this wound. They appear more openly in an English-language text of 1945 in which Adorno observes that, quote, something disquieting and unresolved remains in the phenomenon of Heine, end quote. He talks of the ambivalent reaction provoked by Heine's name. According to Adorno, at the height of his popularity in 19th century Germany, Heine was influential among both artists and intellectuals and also middle-class consumers. And he follows up this observation with a comment about artistic laymen who had found inspiration in Heine. Quote, it is hardly an exaggeration to say that there was no German businessman with cultural ambitions who would not, when he felt compelled to write a birthday poem for his wife or mother, imitate some established model of Heine's. Adorno exaggerated here, no doubt, but his exaggeration tells us something of the cultural aspirations of middle-class households in Germany around 1910. But the talk, Heine the Wound, reveals something specific that the attribute, quote, Jewish, points to but does not capture precisely. We can in fact speak of a general Heine cult in Germany at the turn of the century, which enraged the anti-Semitic pseudo-rebels, but against which they fulminated without success at the time. Just as a side note, this is something that came to mind. I think Heinrich Heine also, I think he was friends with Marx at some point. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But also I know that Hal Draper, who wrote the big books, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, he like translated a book of Heine's poetry, which is interesting. I think it's like the only non-socialist thing that I'm aware of that he did, and then there's probably socialist aspects of it too. But like the main cultural thing that I know he did. The anti-Semites. The anti-Semites' attempts to prevent the erection of the Heine monument in Frankfurt speaks volumes. Toward the end of the century, Heine had become such a controversial figure that the growth of the nationalist and anti-Semitic parties made it impossible to put up monuments to him anywhere in Germany. In 1913, a committee in Frankfurt succeeded in gaining approval to establish the first monument to him in any town in Germany. But even this could not be erected in the center, near the Goethe monument, but only in the eastern part of the city, in Friedberger Park. 20 years later, after having been daubed frequently with swastikas during the Weimar era, it was pulled down by the Nazis, then rescued by local patriots who kept it hidden in the Stettel Art Gallery. Finally, in 1947, it was reinstated, this time somewhat shamefacedly, in Taunus Park, which separated the banking quarter from the red light district for 40 years. It stands there to this day unnoticed. Among the upwardly mobile Jewish middle-class families of the 19th century, Heine did not just stand for a literary fashion, he also represented a social metaphor. Heine was perceived as a successful Jew who achieved in the sphere of culture what was expected from Jews only in economic terms. For the aspiring Jewish middle classes, he embodied their utopia made real. He was the living example of an enlightened way of life that had gained success and recognition. Heine's long exile in France was taken as proof that such a way of life had been prevented by the reactionaries in Germany, especially in Prussia. The success of Jewish emancipation, by which was meant complete equality for Jews, became the core program of almost all Jewish organizations of every shade of opinion. This meant, however, that unlike a large part of the German middle class, the Jews realized that there was no room for them on the political right. The unfulfilled promises of revolution and democracy going back to the Vormärz, the promising time before the failed revolution of 1848, were carried forward with the names of Heine and Börne on their banners. Their feeling was that they might legitimately claim to belong to an avant-garde that was confirmed by the idiosyncratic reactions of those who were hostile to Jews. Many of them were, like Treitschke, an important anti-Semite, to be found in the Hohenzollern establishment of the empire. Footnote: Heinrich von Treitschke, who lived from 1834 to 1896, was a renowned German historian. He was professor of history at the University of Berlin and succeeded Leopold von Ranke as the historiographer of the Prussian state. If you're not a historian, Leopold von Ranke is an extremely important figure. He's kind of like viewed as like something of like the founder of academic history. Anyway, Heinrich von Treitschke was responsible for launching the notorious anti-Semitism debate of 1879, which helped to infect an entire generation of the professional and academic middle class with anti-Semitic prejudices. End footnote. Germans and Jews were inextricably intertwined in Heine's life and works. Even the National Socialists were forced to acknowledge this fact. Germans and Jews are inextricably intertwined in Heine's life and works. Even the National Socialists were forced to acknowledge this fact. The songbooks of the Nazi period were unable to dispense with the, quote, Lorelei, which I don't know what that is. Beneath the text, they printed the lie, quote, unknown, author unknown, unquote. At around the same time, the mainly German Jewish immigrants to the United States came together under the name of Heinrich Heine. These events provided Adorno and also Horkheimer with pretext to comment on Heine's own experience. The basic elements of their joint magnum opus, Dialectic of Enlightenment, are already thematized in Heine's own works and implicit in his ambivalent reception in Germany, in particular the idea of the inexorable advance of a modern enlightened culture that liberates self-destructive forces. In the English-language essays he wrote in 1949, Adorno refused to explain Heine's achievement in terms of his Jewishness. It's not Heine's Jewishness that explains the unmistakable color and texture of his work. Such a classification is superficial. Rarely do we find a passage in Adorno that comes as close to an understanding of himself as this one. It sounds like a reminiscence of the paternal ideal of a secularized Jewishness that succeeds in giving expression to universal tendencies. It is easy for us to imagine how in his youth he may well have opposed his father's proudly held, though perhaps near sentimental belief in his own utopia with an even greater conviction, albeit one tinged with melancholy. In every text dealing with Heine, Adorno always invokes those antipodes, Karl Kraus and Stefan George. Gorgia? I don't know how you say that in German. Stefan George. I'm not sure how you say that in... Maybe it's Georgia? I don't know. As the household gods of artistic contempt for the journalese and the cheap effects in Heine's writing. Nevertheless, the self-assurance of their nonconformist judgments is dissipated by Adorno's own experience of emigration. Adorno now reads Heine with different eyes. The experience of emigration was one that Kraus was spared. Heine anticipated the universal condition of homelessness. Adorno's note of 1963 in Notebook 0, yes, or Notebook O, reads, I guess it's probably 0. It doesn't have the line through it, so I don't know. Notebook 0 reads like the late summation of his maxims and reflections. Quote, whoever belongs among the persecuted has ceased to possess any unbroken form of identification. The concepts of native land, Heimat, country, are all shattered. Only one narrative remains from which one is excluded, mankind. End quote. Adorno. In 1949, over and above any criticism, Adorno credits Heine with having been the first to articulate certain historical experiences of the century. He does not shy away from ascribing to Heine the authoritative ideal of a writer that had been formulated by Karl Kraus, Heine's arch-enemy. This was, quote, to hearken to the sound of the day as if they were the chords of eternity, end quote. In Minima Moralia, Adorno had attempted to do precisely that. The aphoristic form cultivated by both Heine and Krauss seemed to be ideals for such a project. Minima Moralia, which Adorno dedicated to Max Horkheimer, opens with a reflection on parents. His tone seems to be unusually personal. Quote, once we rebelled against their, bracket, our parents, in bracket, insistence on the reality principle, the sobriety forever prone to become wrath against those less ready to renounce. But today we are faced with a generation purporting to be young, yet in all its reactions insufferably more grown up than its parents ever were. Okay. And that's from Adorno, the section titled Grassy Seat in Minima Moralia. Put so generally, this might be said of almost every generation that feels itself to be sandwiched between the young and the old, but the mass murder of the European Jews by the Nazis forced Adorno to depart from the usual line of thought. Quote, one of the Nazi symbolic outrages is the killing of the very old. Such a climate fosters a late, lucid understanding with our parents, as between the condemned, marred only by the fear that we, powerless ourselves, might now be unable to care for them as well as they cared for us when they possessed something, end quote. Adorno. Grassy seat. There is no mention of the word, quote, Jewish in these early pages of Minima Moralia, only the very first aphorism, titled For Marcel Proust, alludes to a specific generational experience that can be seen as a veiled comment on Adorno himself, as well as his two older friends, Horkheimer and Benjamin. Quote, the son of well-to-do parents, whether from talent or weakness, engages in a so-called intellectual profession as an artist or scholar, end quote. Adorno. For Marcel Proust. This reflection would lose its specific flavor if the word, quote, Jewish had been added here. We have to read on for a few pages to become aware of the subterranean displacement of the relations between the generations. Proust's observation that in photographs the grandfather of a duke or a middle-class Jew are so alike that we forget their difference of social rank. As a much wider application, the unity of an epoch objectively abolishes all the distinctions that constitute the happiness, even the moral substance of individual existence. End quote. And that's from the section Antithesis in Minima Moralia. The attribute, quote, Jewish would not explain the experience of the grandparents' generation, but only describe it superficially. What Adorno emphasizes about Heine is that Heine was a genuine child of the emancipation of the Jews who arrived in Germany in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. This emancipation was accompanied by the process of secularization that was feared by Jewish traditionalists as a threat to the Jewish way of life that had been handed down. The abolition of restrictions, the opening of society to new careers, and hence ultimately the rise of an ostracized minority to the point where it could become an integral part of Western European society, cannot be understood without the stimulus of the French Revolution. The material destruction of the power of the churches and monasteries opened doors in southern Germany to the Jews, enabling them to acquire property and gain entry into towns that were hitherto closed to them. The founding of the firm of Bernhard Wiesengrund, Adorno's father, I don't know, maybe this is not his father, maybe it's his grandfather, I can't remember, sorry, I'm forgetting. You'll know. You've listened to the beginning. My mind's going poop. The founding of the firm of Bernhard Wiesengrund at the beginning of the Biedermeier period comes to at a time of epochal conflict with Heine, was the first to articulate. Adorno perceives in Heine's lyrics the, quote, full consciousness of the dialectics of progress, end quote, both political and aesthetic. This dialectic can also be discovered in the history of the Wiesengrunds in the 19th century. The firm's founder must have been open-minded in his attitude toward progress, his awareness of future economic possibilities, and the early transfer of the firm down the River Main suggest that this was the case. The process of secularization is reflected in the family names. Explicitly Jewish given names do not recur. The Wiesengrund, who inherited the firm and who was born in 1838, was called David Theodor. He was Adorno's grandfather. Adorno's father, who was born in 1870, was called Oscar Alexander. He evidently had to join his father's firm because his older brother, Paul Friedrich, had died earlier in 1886 at the age of 17. According to the Register of the Jewish Community in Frankfurt, the members of the family living in Schöne Aussicht 7 in 1880 included under the name of Wiesengrund Adorno's great-grandmother Carolina, who had been born in 1812, and his grandfather David Theodor. His grandfather's brother, who was also active in the wine trade, was recorded at living at Königswarterstrasse 15 in the east end of Frankfurt. His place of work is given as Schöne Aussicht 13. The tradition of the extended Jewish family was still maintained by Adorno's grandfather, David Theodor, after whom Adorno was named. Oscar Wiesengrund was the first member of the family to marry a Catholic, without, however, abandoning his Jewish religion. Why he should have left the community, which incidentally he did at the same time as Leo Löwenthal's father, remains a mystery. The Frankfurt Registry of Residents has recorded the history of the family of Oscar Wiesengrund down to the graduation of his only son, Theodor Ludwig. An entry on the 21st of October 1900 announces the birth of his stillborn child. It is possible that Teddie's mother, Maria Barbara née Calvelli Adorno, kept this to herself. The official in charge of the registry seems to have been so confused by the religious affiliations that he made the additions Israelite, quote, Israelite, and, quote, Catholic, a genuine mixed marriage. Maria did not give birth to her son Theodor Ludwig until a relatively advanced age, shortly before her 38th birthday. The Wiesengrunds did not possess Frankfurt, quote, ancestors of the kind ascribed to the established Jewish families in Krakauer's novel Ginster. Fantasies about their origins, cultivated by Adorno among others, were all associated with his mother's hyphenated name, Calvelli Adorno. Her father, a retired army officer of Corsican origin, is rumored to have earned his living in Frankfurt as a fencing master. His wife, Elisabeth Henning, earned a living as an artiste. Calvelli was forced to marry her in secular London because he could not afford the cost of citizenship in Christian patriarchal Frankfurt. Since French citizenship did not apply to children born and brought up abroad, Maria Calvelli Adorno remained stateless until her marriage to Oscar Wiesengrund. This also explains why the wedding took place in London in 1898, for if the different religious alliances had been the sole problematic factor, there would have been no impediment in Frankfurt according to the civil law of 1850. Adorno's fantasies about his ancestors focused on his mother's name. According to a report of Peter von Haselberg, which needs to be taken with some caution, Adorno himself linked her name with that of the aristocratic Genoan family, Adorno della Piana. This might easily be dismissed as a character quirk. Adorno himself pointed out that Thomas Mann found such a foible for the nobility amusing in the case of Rudolf Borchardt and Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Adorno made use of Hofmannsthal's strategy, quote, that he would rather give a good explanation for a weakness that he had been reproached with than deny it, end quote, in defending Marcel Proust against the accusation of snobbery. The fantasy of exalted origins ignited by an aristocratic name rescues the imagined person from the trammels of bourgeois competition. Selmar Speer, who spent his childhood in Frankfurt before 1914, although he belonged to a Jewish family that arrived in the town later than the Wiesengrunds, points to the deep satisfaction felt in his judgment by, quote, most German Jews, end quote, when commercial counselor Friedländer Fult was granted permission around 1900 to put a, quote, font before his name. The social advancement, which in the case of Jews was generally the reward for economic achievement, did not mean integration into the middle classes, but could even include entry into the nobility. This paradox characterizes the idea of incontrovertibly high rank that does not need to be acquired through achievement, such as is to be found in both Hofmannsthal and Proust. Quote, like every love, snobbery wants to escape from the entanglement of bourgeois relationships into a world that no longer uses the greatest good of the greatest number to gloss over the fact that it satisfies human needs only by accident. Proust's regression is utopian. End quote. Adorno. In Fin de Siècle, I never know how to pronounce his name. In Fin de Siècle, turn of the century, the principle of bourgeois society that what counts as merit, not origins, is exposed as untrue. In Germany, the incomplete nature of bourgeois emancipation during the Second Empire became inescapable. Quote, German society, recruited from the rural gentry and the big industrialists, was less closely bound to the artistic and philosophical tradition than Western European society. After 1870, the leisure class was in general nervous and unsure of itself in its relation to culture. The intellectuals it saw were nervous and unsure of themselves, unable to forget how ready their patrons were to throw out anyone who became troublesome. End quote. Adorno, that's from the George Hofmannsthal correspondence, 1891 to 1906. Parenthesis, and that's from 1930 to 1940 in Prisms. The fact that Adorno's mother, Maria Calvelli Adorno, had enjoyed some success in Vienna as a court singer allowed Adorno to speak of Vienna as his, quote, second home, end quote. From this perspective, origins are no longer a fate but a choice. Even Adorno's insistence in 1949 that Heine's Jewish origins were merely an accidental feature of his work is a response to the anti-Semitic approach that Heine's works were, quote, Jewish. The fiction of origins that Hofmannsthal did not weary of entertaining and whose parameters are defined by Proust is an attempt to escape from this dilemma. Adorno's origins and interest in origins and names as a specific phenomenon independent of the mechanics of competition can be seen not just in the short commentaries on Proust, but also in the 1942 essay on the correspondence between George and Hofmannsthal that he dedicated to Walter Benjamin. As early as 1922, Benjamin, who was distantly related to Hofmannsthal, had written an essay on Goethe's Wahlverwandtschaften, elective affinities, in which he explored the theme of contingency and freedom as something that entered into the most intimate relationships. The hopeless situation of a society that closes itself off to the other was a source of painful experience to the generation of both Benjamin and Adorno, whose parents aspired to combine bourgeois culture with the ideal of the gentleman. Quote, the impossibility of love that Proust depicts in his Socialites has since then spread like a deadly chill over all of society, where a functionalized totality stifles love wherever it stirs. In this respect, Proust was prophetic, a quality he once attributed to the Jews. End quote. Adorno. It is through the reflection on works of art that the unconscious history of the epoch is rendered visible. Personal secrets, the source of pleasure and suffering, are encoded as social riddles. The persistence with which Adorno kept returning to Proust and Thomas Mann, George and Hofmannsthal, seems closely related to the, quote, childlike obstinacy that he praised in Proust. The persistence with which Adorno keeps returning to Proust and Thomas Mann, George and Hofmannsthal seems closely related to, quote, the childlike obstinacy that he praises in Proust. Adorno is on the track of the process of concealment characteristic of bourgeois society, but he does not content himself with the artist's self-idealizations, which he sees through as the, quote, masks of genius. In the literary essays of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, something of Adorno the child shines through. Quote, that aura of disguise, of miming, which attracts the child to the theater, not because the child wants to see a work of art, but because it wants to have its own pleasure in dissimulation confirmed. Unquote. Adorno, Bourgeois Opera. Where the hell am I? The theater public, all dressed up for occasion, provides a model of society in which even the individual is ready to don masks and draperies which, through the very act of cloaking him, reveals his social status. In Proust's novel, The Guermantes Way, Adorno praises, quote, the description of the theater as a prehistoric Mediterranean landscape, end quote. And this elicits from him the comment that, quote, Proust, born in 1871, already saw the world with the eyes of someone 30 or 50 years younger. Hence, at a new stage in the novel form, he also represents a new mode of experience, end quote. Adorno's sense of his closeness to Proust's novel, whose chronology he reckoned coincided with his own childhood, makes this passage especially illuminating. Society is an unresolved part of, quote, history's bondage to nature, end quote, appears as the, quote, mythical landscape into whose allegorical image what is unattainable and unapproachable congeals, end quote. Reading these sentences enables us to imagine a visit to the Frankfurt Opera House around 1910, an age in which the private sponsors of the costly neo-Renaissance building still had their own private boxes. Zelmar Speer recalls in his memoir, For 1914, how, quote, in front of the opera house after the evening performance, a commissionaire in livery called out the names of the families to the waiting carriages that belonged to them. Bettman, Passafant, Koch, etc. Unquote. These opera-goers can be thought of as the symbol of continental European society before 1914. This can be contrasted with America, which as an immigrant Adorno thought of as a, quote, radically bourgeois country. End quote. Adorno. Reading these where am I? Adorno's Frankfurt childhood is marked by the experience of liberalism as a mixed social form in which the vestiges of feudalism overlap with the forces of industrialism. The specific German variant of continental European society in the last third of the 19th century is something Adorno described as, quote, semi-civilized. The conflict between belonging and being excluded is the signature of bourgeois literature. Goethe himself had treated this subject in exemplary fashion in the book Wilhelm Meister. Maybe that's a play, I'm not sure. In the 19th century, the artist novel became a literary genre in Germany. It runs like a thread through Thomas Mann's entire work. The lack of clarity about the role of the bourgeois in German society caused Hofmannsthal to make his escape into high society, with its greater urbanity, whereas Stefan Gorga toyed with the role of the pariah, who suddenly stands revealed as a gentleman. Quote, overwhelming anxiety fosters the image of the gentleman as the historical model for the timeless George, the phantasma of the fin de siècle. I'm pretty sure that's how you say that. I'm not sure. End quote. Adorno. Similarly, Adorno's father, Oscar Wiesengrund, cultivated close business ties with England and oriented himself toward the ideal of the English gentleman in a way that was not uncommon for Jewish businessmen in Frankfurt at the time. Conflicts with one's bourgeois father formed part of the staple diet of the experience of entire generations. The theme of patricide in the literature of expressionism thrives on this. The reflection titled, quote, for Marcel Proust, in Minima Moralia, which promises to deliver fragments of a, quote, doctrine of the, quote, of the good, a, quote, doctrine of the good life, end quote, is followed by an aphorism titled, quote, grassy seat. Considered from the vantage point of 1914, Adorno's picture of his bourgeois parents looks different. Quote, one realizes with horror that earlier opposing one's parents because they represented the world, one was often secretly the mouthpiece against a bad world of one even worse, end quote. Adorno. In bourgeois families, the conflict between earning a living and pursuing one's cultural interests was an immediate experience. As second son, he was compelled to follow in the economic footsteps of the eldest son who had died prematurely. Adorno's father must have felt the force of circumstances directly. He was evidently extracted to the stage. The singer Maria Calvelli Adorno had turned his head. As far as social standing was concerned, a marriage between the two is completely unsatisfactory, both in religious terms and by bourgeois criteria. Maria's mother, Elizabeth Henning, the only daughter of a master tailor in Bockenheim, had met and then married the lodger Jean Calvelli. She had already had the advantage of training in singing. There is a photograph of Adorno's grandmother with her 3 children, Maria, Agatha, and Louise, in the Frankfurt, quote, Zalbau, in 1879. Louis, too, had to abandon music for a more practical profession, although admittedly he had success in it, ending up as a bank director. Maria's sister Agatha was saved from this fate by the unconventional conduct of Teddie's father. Following his marriage to Maria, who had enjoyed her greatest success at the Vienna Hofoperntheater in 1885, both she and her sister joined his household. In this unusual family circle, Teddie must have felt the, quote, urge to resolve a conflict, end quote, against which, as the artistically gifted son, he must have rebelled. The Wiesengrund-Adorno household, which still inhabited the ground floor of the house in Schöne Aussicht, as late as 1914, cannot be imagined as the typical middle-class household of the period, nor can it be maintained, as we find suggested in the legends that have grown up around Adorno, that his non-Jewish relatives belonged to the cultivated upper bourgeoisie. The Calvelli Adornos were really outsiders and a bit of a motley crew, something that Teddie may well have found attractive. He enjoyed clambering down into the cellar to play with boys from the pub milieu of Sachsenhausen, or making a surprise appearance in the street dressed up as a Spanish nobleman. At any rate, Adorno provided Andreas Count Rutz-Umovsky with a story along these lines so as to enable the latter to publish a well-informed article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung for Adorno's 65th birthday. The article is notable for the absence of such Adorno legends as the claim that Agatha was a famous concert pianist, on the grounds that she was said to have once accompanied the world-famous singer Adelina Patti. The reality was that both sisters and even their mother, Elizabeth, had once accompanied Patti to New York on her triumphal tour celebrating her silver jubilee on the stage. They did not accompany her on the piano, however, but only on board the city of Berlin. Maria made an appearance in Boston and then returned to Frankfurt. At home there was not only constant music, but also amateur dramatics and performances with highly elaborate costumes that went back to his earliest childhood. These were not things that Teddie had to learn outside the home. They were things with which he was already familiar. His mother performed in public even after he was born, and according to her, Teddie is supposed on one occasion to have made his way onto the stage uninvited and to have recited some poems by heart. Even then, appearing before an audience had already become second nature to him. Quote, music that we are accustomed to calling, quote, classical is something I came to know as a child through playing duets on the piano, end quote. He observes in a piece he wrote for the Vossische Zeitung in 1933, a piece that spurred Walter Benjamin to pursue his studies on his own childhood in Berlin. Quote, this music, more than any other, was suited to playing at home. It was produced on the piano, which was simply a piece of furniture, and those who set about it without fear of stumbling or playing false notes all belonged to the family, end quote. Adorno. In these words, we can hear the echo of the descriptions of the ideal 19th century middle-class family for whom Goethe's maxims were still an integral part of daily life. Adorno was thinking of Felix Mendelssohn's book, Songs Without Words, when he wrote his Words Without Songs in 1931. Or maybe it's in italics, but I guess it's a major work. It's not a piece. I keep saying the book because I just see the italics, but it's not. Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, when he wrote his Words Without Songs in 1931, a piece that leads directly back to his own childhood. Quote, playing duets was a gift I received at birth at the start of the 20th century at the hands of the genie of the bourgeois 19th century. Music for duets was the kind of music that you could get on with and live with before musical constraints ordained solitude and secret craftsmanship. End quote. Adorno. As early as 1930, the long bourgeois 19th century had already ceased being any more than a memory, but it could still be retained as a significant social experience. Quote, that every individual could find himself to a greater or lesser degree in the symphony is demonstrated by the fact that he could respond to it with his family in his own home, without its losing any of its authority, just as he could hang classic pictures on the wall. But playing duets was even better than Booklands and piece Isle of the Dead over the sideboard. One had constantly to earn the symphony if one was to possess it by playing it. End quote. Within the family at the turn of the century, Adorno could still experience the 19th century bourgeoisie as a living reality in which the individual might be oppressed, but by which he was also strengthened, if not indeed produced. In his brief text titled Piano Duets Once Again, Vierhändig noch einmal, Adorno pays a literary tribute to his family by singling out, quote, its sheltering, protective quality that was uniquely capable of nurturing a talent in isolation, end quote. Adorno. Adorno did not suggest that this middle-class educational tradition was without flaws. As early as the fin de siècle, again, I can't remember how to pronounce that word, this kind of music making in the family home seemed old-fashioned. Quote, in the age of a strict division of labor, the middle class defended their ultimate music in the fortress of the piano, which they accompanied in force, ruthlessly, indifferent to the way it must have sounded to others, the alienated. Even the mistakes which they inevitably made preserved an active link with the works that those who listened, enthralled to concert performances, had long since ceased to possess as their own. The price for this had, of course, to be paid by the duet players, with their old-fashioned domestic approach and their untrained dilettantism. But this dilettantism is nothing but the echo and the degenerate product of the true music-making tradition. It remains to be asked for whom the last artist will meaningfully play once the last dilettante who still dreams of being an artist has died out. End quote. Adorno. This criticism can be seen in its true light only when we know that as an adult, Adorno used to play duets even with friends who were not professional musicians. In the piece Piano Duets Once Again, we can see Adorno as a child turning the pages of a score, in the piece Piano Duets Once Again, we can see Adorno as a child turning the pages of a score, following, quote, only his ear and his memory, end quote, long before he could read the notes. It was not just his mother who sat next to him at the piano, but also her sister, Agatha, a highly accomplished pianist whom Adorno sometimes called, quote, did, i.e. dad, like as in father. Agatha, whom Horkheimer affectionately referred to as Adorno's second mother, must also have assumed some paternal characteristics. In the family, and also among Adorno's friends, Agatha was regarded as an impressive figure to be treated with respect. She insisted on the highest musical standards and was known for her apodictic judgments, but she also followed the intellectual fashions of the 1920s, ranging from Kierkegaard to the cinema. In a letter in which his distress is evident, Adorno reported her death on the 26th of June 1935 to Ernst Krenek. I don't know, I don't know what the sound means, but over the R in Krenek, Krenek, there's like a inverted accent, so like a upside down arrow kind of thing. Upside down two-sided triangle, I guess. Where am I? In a letter in which his distress is evident, Adorno reported her death on the 26th of June 1935 to Ernst Krenek, writing from Nazi Germany, where he had gone to visit his family despite the great anxiety of his friends. Having retreated to the familiar old holiday resort, the Baron Hotel in Hornburg, in the Black Forest, Adorno wrote some of his most moving letters to his composer friend from Vienna and to Walter Benjamin in Paris. He also wrote after some delay, quote, for the well-known reasons, unquote, that Nazi censors in the post office were opening the letters to Horkheimer and to Gabriele Oppenheim, who was likewise already in exile. Quote, I cannot express that what losing her really means to me. It is not so much the death of a relative as above all that of the person closest to me of all, my most faithful friend, a piece of nature that has always enabled me to regenerate myself. I am utterly at a loss and am only gradually coming to visualize the possibility that, and how, I am to go on living, end quote, Adorno. As if Adorno suspected, the disinterested reader might well just shake his head in bewilderment on reading these lines and find this account of the loss of an aunt on the part of a man of 32 somewhat overstated. Adorno added, quote, this sounds highly excessive, but you can believe me that it does not contain an atom of exaggeration and sentimentality, end quote. Adorno. There's two footnotes that I missed. Footnote. The description of Aunt Agatha as Adorno's, quote, second mother occurs in Horkheimer's speech congratulating Adorno on his 60th birthday. In this essay, Horkheimer, who came from a manufacturing background, gives a somewhat idealized picture of life in the Heimerstrasse. And footnote. Footnote. In a letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 21st of October 1935, following his return to Oxford from Germany, quote, I have no need to tell you what the loss of Agatha means to me. I am not exaggerating when I say that my entire private existence has fundamentally changed, end quote. Adorno, 1935. Adorno's image of a, quote, life lived rightly, end quote, and his critique of the, quote, wrong life, end quote, seems to be bound up with his unusual household, in which his father renounced his own artistic leanings in order to pursue them in private life. Quote, the end of the family paralyzes the forces of opposition. The rising collectivist order is a mockery of a classless one. Together with the bourgeois, it liquidates the utopia that once drew sustenance from motherly love. End quote. Adorno. And that's from The Grassy Seat, a section of Minima Moralia. Quote, the dream of being an artist, end quote, is hard to resist in an atmosphere of this kind. Adorno could see that Thomas Mann was motivated by something that he too felt. Quote, a longing for applause. End quote. Anyone who ever saw Adorno take a bow at the end of a lecture can understand his appreciation of Mann's coyness. Quote, there is something in the gracefulness of the form of even an intellectual work of art that is related to the grace with which the actor takes his bow. Mann wanted to charm and to please. End quote. Adorno. But this theatrical element was linked to memories of his own childhood performances. Adorno has drawn attention to Hugo von Hofmannsthal's preference for blank verse, which is, quote, designed to serve the needs of the actor inherent in the theatrical form, ... It is also, however, the verse bequeathed to the child by a theater which, since Hofmannsthal's youth, has reserved Hamlet and Schiller for school, end quote. Hofmannsthal himself had, quote, traced his efforts at intellectual disguise back to his childhood, end quote. Adorno. His fantasy of noble birth, one he shared with Adorno, corresponded to this liking for fancy dress. Adorno produced an elegant description to define Hofmannsthal's love of the theater, quote, the magical power to manipulate childhood is the strength of the weak, end quote. Adorno's observations impressed Benjamin, who not only knew Hofmannsthal well, but also produced a literary exploration of memories of a secularized Jewish childhood during the final phase of the German Empire, which has no equal. Although children from good families such as Adorno and Benjamin enjoyed excellent prospects for improving their social position in the first decade of the 20th century, this does not mean that they were spared sorrow and trauma during their childhood. In 1950, Adorno comments on Benjamin's book Berlin Childhood around 1900, quote, for the images that it evokes in disconcerting immediacy are not idyllic, nor are they contemplative. Over them lies the shadow of the Hitlerian Reich. As in a dream, they marry the anticipatory horror of that Reich with processes that lie deep in the past. With a sense of panic, the bourgeois mind becomes conscious of the disintegrating aura of its own biographical past, and indeed of itself it appears as illusion, end quote. As a social theorist, Adorno is attempting to define in sociological terms what Benjamin had tried to encapsulate as a specific experience. Quote, the family is presented with the bill not just for the brutal oppression that was experienced right up to the threshold of the modern age by the weaker sex and especially by children at the hands of the head of the family, but also for economic justice, the exploitation of domestic labor in a society that otherwise works in obedience to the laws of the market, as well as the renunciation of instincts exacted by family discipline from its members without their feeling certain that this discipline was always justified and without their truly believing that they would receive proper compensation, in the form of, say, secure property to be handed on, as had appeared to be the case at the height of the liberal era, end quote. And that's... Is that Benjamin? I think that's Adorno. This comment was written in 1955. Okay, yes, it was Adorno. In other words, after the fact. It could also be read as a warning not to idealize the bourgeois family of the age of liberalism. The deceptive nature of the bourgeois family follows a historical tendency that is traced back to early experiences. In his Berlin Chronicle, the studies for his memoirs, which echoed Adorno's, quote, piano duets once again, end quote, and which remained unpublished during his lifetime, Benjamin speaks of the economic basis, quote, on which the finances of my parents rested, end quote, as of something that was shrouded, quote, in deepest secrecy, end quote, a secret that long outlasted his childhood and youth. It is easy to understand the attractions of a Marxist critique of political economy for many children from bourgeois families in which the father earned his living as a merchant in the realm of the circulation of capital, but that theory promised to resolve the mystery. The threats which seemed to hang over the security of the parental household were connected with the veiling of its economic dependency. With the family's move from Schöne Aussicht to Seeheimerstrasse in 1914, the separation of the family from its economic basis became a lived fact. The culture that was enjoyed in the bourgeois household now came to contain an element of illusion. Quote, like all forms of mediation between individual biological creatures, the nuclear family and an integrated society, the family finds its substance sucked from it by that society, as does the economic sphere of circulation, or the category of culture which is so intimately bound up with the family." End quote. Adorno. The classic novelist of the German bourgeoisie, Thomas Mann, played with this veiling of reality by presenting himself as the somewhat stiff and chilly son of a Hanseatic magnate. Adorno referred to disguises like this as a, quote, mask of genius, end quote, which were designed to oppose the 19th century cult of genius, with its, quote, Rembrandtian head, the velvet and the artist beret, end quote. One could go further and argue that behind the bourgeois facade of the artist lay concealed the feeling of shame, quote, that from the standpoint of the individual and his fate, it is a matter of chance whether a person turns out to be a genius or not, end quote. Adorno. The individual is mediated by his family down to his innermost core. It is for this reason that Adorno starts out in Minimum Morale with reflections on origins and professions. This collection of aphorisms is not merely dedicated to his older friend Max Horkheimer. It fits him like a glove. Comparisons with like and unlike are initiated with the very first aphorism, the one titled For Marcel Proust, to which the preceding Dedications leads up. It represents, quote, the attempt to present aspects of our shared philosophy from the standpoint of subjective experience, end quote. Adorno. This process of identifying with a self-chosen elder brother is part of a pattern that recurs in a number of Adorno's friendships, those with Krakauer, with Benjamin, and with Horkheimer himself. All four men came from similar, though by no means identical, backgrounds. The spectrum extends from the lower middle class right through to the upper. In this last letter to Adorno on the 7th of May, 1940, shortly before his abortive flight to Spain, Benjamin wrote about Adorno's essay on the correspondence between George and Hofmannsthal. He praised Adorno's insight into the, quote, child in Hofmannsthal, but as a notorious loner, he also refers to something that is only hinted at by Adorno. Quote, "You are quite right to bring up my Proust. I have been thinking about his work a great deal recently, and once again my thoughts seem to correspond closely with your own here. You speak felicitously about the experience of, quote, that's not what I meant at all, end quote, that experience when time turns into something we have lost, and it seems to me that Proust was unable to find a deeply hidden, but not therefore necessarily an unconscious, model for his fundamental experience, namely the experience of, quote, that's not it, end quote, with regard to the assimilation of French Jews. You will remember the famous passage in Sodom et Gomorrah, in which the complicity of sexual inverts is compared with the constellation governing the way the Jews behave amongst one another. The very fact that Proust was only half Jewish allowed him insight into the highly precarious structure of assimilation, an insight which was then externally confirmed by the Dreyfus affair. End quote. Adorno. Gershom Scholem, Benjamin's friend from childhood, was also formed a friendship later on with Adorno, though not with Horkheimer, never tired of pointing to this, quote, that's not it at all, as a mark of the assimilation of the German Jews. The daily experience of Jews who had risen into the middle classes flatly contradicted the ideology of the enlightened liberal bourgeoisie to which they thought they belonged. Quote, one day it suddenly struck me that the friends who came to visit us at home were all Jews. The exceptions were all restricted to formal occasions when people came to offer congratulations. They included my father's colleagues from the printing trade. We were a family of print workers, from the health insurance company where he held an honorary position on the board, or for some other association he belonged to. End quote. Adorno. No, Gershom Scholem. This is the position in what was on the whole the lower middle class environment in which the Scholems moved in the mid-1890s in Berlin. Here too baptism was looked at askance, while the situation with mixed marriages was quite difficult. Quote, Their attitude toward mixed marriages was very divided and frequently quite irrational. My father, who was a vocal advocate of assimilation, refused to accept mixed marriages among his own family and friends. In accordance with his theory, he should have welcomed them. But when my brother married a non-Jewess, he never exchanged another word with her again after a single brief encounter. My mother, on the other hand, who came from a family dominated by traditional Jewish piety, and regarded her Judaism, when she thought about it at all, as a matter of feeling rather than a biological fact, was untroubled by mixed marriages. She had not the slightest difficulty with marriages of either my brother or her own sister, who was one of the first women to be allowed to qualify as a doctor in Berlin. End quote. Scholem. Similar reactions were no doubt to be expected in Frankfurt on the marriage of Oscar Alexander Wiesengrund and Maria Calvelli-Adorno, whose wedding took place in London in July 1898. Everything about the family history of the Wiesengrunds bears the marks of the process by which Jews who sought integration into civil society were affected by the specifically German problems of citizenship arising from the principle of descent. The jus sanguinis, according to which citizenship could be granted only to people of German parentage, Toward the end of the century, Berlin and Frankfurt am Main became centers of German Jewry. At the time of Adorno's birth, 20% of all Jews in the German Empire lived in one or the other of these two cities. Throughout the entire century, Jews had been in the vanguard of the trend toward urbanization, while the Christian population followed in their wake. By the end of the century, the social structure of the Jewish population did exhibit one special feature. 56% of active Jewish adults were employed in trade. Their children, however, tended to move away from industry and turn instead to the independent or academic professions. A particular domestic climate came to prevail in secularized Jewish households, which made it difficult to maintain Jewish traditions. Heine's tongue-in-cheek quip about baptism as, quote, the entry ticket to European culture, end quote, had referred to an entirely different social situation, one in which reactionary laws explicitly blocked access to the independent and academic professions for the children of Jewish tradesmen. Toward the end of the 19th century, baptism had become anathema to aspiring middle-class Jews. Since the different faiths had been granted formal equality, baptism had ceased to be necessary. What distinguished Jewish families from the average German family was the emphasis they placed on education and culture. What merged was not ethnic designations such as, quote, German and, quote, Jew, but enlightenment and classicism, humanism and progress. What traditional and neo-Orthodox Jews tended politically towards, while traditional and neo-Orthodox while traditional and neo-Orthodox Jews tended politically toward conservatism, the advocates of progress among the Frankfurt Jews identify with the left liberalism of Leopold Sonnemann's Frankfurter Zeitung. Leopold Löwenthal's father, Victor, who was born in 1864, formed a friendship with Oscar Alexander Wiesengrund, who was 6 years his junior. One of 9 siblings, he succeeded in qualifying as a doctor. Leo Löwenthal reported later that all his father's siblings stayed loyal to Orthodox Judaism and the traditional Jewish way of life. Quote, my father wanted to be a lawyer, but my grandfather, according to my father at least, refused to grant him permission because he thought this would mean that my father would have to work and write on the Sabbath. Consequently, he prevailed on my father to study medicine, which my father did, though his heart wasn't in it at all. But then he took his revenge, either consciously or unconsciously, when he later became totally, quote, free, not just irreligious, but decidedly anti-religious, end quote. Leo Löwenthal. Löwenthal's paternal grandfather was a teacher in the neo-Orthodox Samson Raphael Hirsch school. According to Zelmar Speer, this was the most, quote, pious school that a German Jew could conceivably imagine, end quote. Zelmar Speer. It was highly conservative, but fostered a synthesis of Jewish orthodoxy and classical German humanism in a way that would be barely comprehensible today. Not even such products of the Christian musical tradition as the St. Matthew Passion were felt to be in conflict with New Orthodox Judaism. In the case of the Speer family, the choice of a Jewish school was still the prerogative of his grandfather. A possible alternative in Frankfurt would have been the celebrated Philanthropinum, where Siegfried Krakauer's uncle, Isidor, worked as a teacher. But what decided the choice of school was, of course, his distance from the family home. The Jewish secondary school was simply closer to the Speer's home at Eschenheimer Anlage II. For his father, this may simply have represented a pragmatic compromise between family traditions and everyday practicality. For his son, the Hebrew classes were sheer torture. The existential compromise of Zelmar Speer's father consisted not just in his accepting his father-in-law's dominance with the family, which meant that it was his father-in-law who decided that what school his son should attend. In addition, Zelmar's father, Simon, experienced the maxim governing the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, a complete contradiction. According to this maxim, one should live as a human being in society while remaining a Jew at home. Quote, my father used to put on tefillin, but he also went to work on the Sabbath. Okay. Speer. The pressure of competition toward the end of the 19th century must have been especially intense. People simply could not afford to observe the traditional festivals. We should not allow ourselves to paint too rosy a picture of economic prospects during the last third of the 19th century. The extended depression reinforced the views of those who thought that the future lay in more education rather than business. The education of children was often left in the hands of their mothers, since the fathers were absorbed in the activities away from home. This, too, was a feature characteristic of Jewish families. Quote, the Jewish family was clearly distinguished from non-Jewish ones not just by the degree of their urbanization, their tendency to have fewer children, or the particular position of the main provider, but also by the role of the wife and the mother. The Jewish mother had few children, went out to work less often than other women, and had the benefit of a superior education. A simple comparison of the differences in education among men and women in Prussia shows that the gulf between them and the non-Jewish population was twice as large as in the Jewish sector. End quote. Speer. This development culminated in the choice of an educated woman whose non-Jewish background ceased to be an impediment to marriage. A new mother became the center of the modern Jewish household, in which a secularized culture had taken the place of the Jewish tradition. There seems to have been a particular emphasis on language acquisition. This made it possible to assess the degree of integration. The concept of acculturation does not suffice here, since the traditional language of the upper class by no means embodied the ideal of a cultured mastery of the language. In the Speer family, for example, where the entire process of secularization appears in accelerated form, more concentrated than in the case of the Wiesengrunds, Speer's mother had the task of finding a German housemaid whose outstanding quality had to be, her, quote, her pure German, unquote. This lofty linguistic ideal was intensified further by such masters of the German language as Hugo von Hofmannsthal and Karl Kraus. But it did not qualify the people who strove to achieve it to become the assimilated members of high society or even an established middle class. A clear High German spoken by a young boy in Frankfurt around 1910 might easily stamp him as an outsider. Adorno would recall such a situation from his childhood in his later essay titled Words from Abroad. Quote, as I was conversing harmlessly with a comrade in the streetcar on my way to school, old Drybus, a neighbor who lived on my street, attacked me in rage. Quote, you speak little devil. You goddamned little devil. Shut up with your High German and learn to speak German right. Unquote. I had scarcely recovered from the fright der Drybus gave me when he was brought home in a push-cart not long afterwards, completely intoxicated, and it is probably not much later that he died. End quote. Adorno. Adorno referred to this incident as his first experience of Rankuna, rancor or spite, in parentheses. Quote, a word that has no proper native equivalent I said that word wrong. Adorno referred to this incident as his first experience of Rankuna, rancor or spite. Quote, a word that has no proper native equivalent in German unless one were to confuse it with the word ressentiment, resentment, a word currently enjoying an unfortunate popularity in Germany. End quote. 2 or 3 generations previously, the word used would have been rishis, parenthesis, Yiddish for, quote, slander, especially anti-Semitic slander. Jews who tried an artistic route to emancipation wanted to escape from the richesse, slander. Giacomo Meyerbeer escaped from Biedermeier, Berlin to Paris, but as early as 1818, he warned his brother, Michael Beer, who had belonged to the enlightened circle around Heinrich Heine and Edward Gans, the disciple of Hegel, quote, take care not to forget the iron word richus, something I forgot when choosing my profession. Individuals may forget this word for a while, but not forever, but in a larger assembly of people, since only one person need remember in order to recall the natural condition of the entire mass. Unquote. Giacomo Meyerbeer. Meyerbeer was on the same wavelength as Heine when it came to grasping the transformation of the traditional hatred of Jews into a hatred of artists of Jewish origin. Quote, 99% of the readers are reshoyim, slanderers. That is why they will always enjoy rishis, slander, if it is not too blatant, end quote. He wrote in 1839, although he personally had enjoyed considerable success as a composer in Paris. Neither culture nor refinement spells the end of the dislike of outsiders. We can explain Heine's passing flirtations with revolutionary movements in the pre-1848 period as the wish to escape from a society which otherwise offered no way out. The feeling that society outside the family is hostile is one that reaches back into childhood. Even the fantasy of aristocratic origins is influenced by the power of a prejudice that is felt to be ineluctable. Such feelings can even be discerned in Adorno's reflections on Hofmannsthal. Quote, Hofmannsthal also claimed to transcend society, and the thought of the outsider is never foreign to one who must simulate his own society. End quote. Adorno. To discover oneself in a terrestrial realm beyond money and work is what distinguishes the particular atmosphere that can in fact be experienced, quote, in immediate, nourishing, warm relations, end quote. The less the family can make these a reality, the more this absence of experience turns into a source of rancor that no, quote, child prodigy can escape. But precisely because the family cannot be the extraterritorial ideal that it ought to be, according to the indestructible ideology of the family, the cosseted child ends up with Can you get in?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you need me to move?
No, you're fine.
The less the family can make these a reality, the more this absence of experience turns into a source of rancor that no quote child policy can escape. Sorry, I got spaced out there because I was like parked next to someone and the spots are really close. To discover oneself in a terrestrial realm beyond money and work is what Wait, fuck, where I fucked it up. Sorry, everybody, this is fucking annoying. To discover oneself in a terrestrial realm beyond money and work is what distinguishes the particular atmosphere that can in fact only be experienced in immediate, nourishing, warm relations, end quote. The less the family can make these a reality, the more this absence of experience turns into a source of rancor that no quote child prodigy can escape. But precisely because the family cannot be the extraterritorial ideal that it ought to be according to the indestructible ideology of the family, the cosseted child ends up with characteristics that inevitably attract hostility, and not just from adults. The prodigy's precociousness provokes external pressure. Quote, if the early maturer is more than a possessor of dexterities, he is obliged to catch himself up, a compulsion which normal people are fond of dressing up as a moral imperative, end quote. Adorno. The prodigy's narcissism, which makes autarky seem possible in a world of dependencies, invites aggression. We can hear aggressive overtones even if the latter reminiscences of Adorno's schoolmates, fellow students, and contemporaries, overtones that condemn the genius to the condition of outsider. The disharmonious experience of his own individuality is implicit in the language that Adorno gave as the crucial explanation for his return to Germany. In Germany, however, resistance to his ideas focused repeatedly on his use of language, above all on his insistence on using words of foreign origin and his savage criticism of the quote, jargon of authenticity. That trend toward linguistic chauvinism characteristic of post-Nazi Germany. Adorno's plea on behalf of foreign words contains, quote, something of the utopia of language, a language without earth, without subjection to the spell of historical existence, a utopia that lives on unawares in the childlike use of language, end quote. Adorno. Even these words of Adorno's, which are perhaps not easily comprehensible on first hearing, were broadcast over the radio as part of a service that had been entrusted with a role in public education in the Germany of the post-Hitler period. It was above all pedagogic subjects that introduced Adorno's voice to a public that would have been most unlikely to come into contact with his text or his music. His pointed criticisms of the normal practices of the culture industry and the daily grind in the universities provoked the ambivalent attitude toward any intellectual views advanced with authority that derive from the arsenal of the, quote, taboos on the teaching profession, end quote. Adorno's return to Frankfurt University in the 1950s forced Adorno to face up to the constraints of teacher training. His conclusions are scathing, quote, the language in the examination papers is outdone by what is heard in the oral part of the exam. Often it is a stammering interspersed with vague qualifying phrases, such as, quote, to a certain extent, end quote, that in the same instant they are uttered try to evade responsibility for what is said. Words of foreign derivation, even names of foreigners, constitute hurdles that are seldom surmounted without some damage either to hurdle or candidate. For instance, most of the candidates who have chosen for their exam a philosopher who is apparently as easy as Hobbes speak of him as Hobbes. I don't know, this is like some kind of weird accent thing going on. It's like like the two B's in Hobbes are like, or one of the B's and the first part of Hobbes is not in italics, the second part of Hobbes is in italics. Most of the candidates who have chosen for their exam of philosophers apparently as easy as Hobbes speak of him as Hobbes, as though the best Hobbes. Okay, that's what I was saying here. Hobbes, as though the best belonged to the dialect in which ebus means, quote, etvos, unquote. The very idea of dialect. One might rightly expect from culture that it accustom a regional language, which is coarseness, to more polished manners, end quote. Adorno. This comment in a radio talk in 1961 unleashed a flood of listeners' responses that induced Adorno to add a footnote to the text he had revised for publication. Quote, I do not mean that culture signifies that every trace of dialect within a pitiless standard language has been eradicated. It merely suffices, for example, to hear the Vietnamese intonation in order to learn just how deeply linguistic humanitarianism is realized in such tonalities, end quote. Adorno. This vocal coloring had reached Adorno's ears early on in his parents' house. Adorno several times spoke of Vienna as his, quote, second home, end quote. The, quote, human is indissolubly linked with imitation. A human being only becomes human at all by imitating other human beings. In such behavior, the primal form of love, the priest of authenticity, sent traces of the utopia which could shake the structure of domination, end quote. Adorno. We hear echoes of the motif of the homeland not as a bond with the soil, but as a social relationship. A sensitive passage in Minima Moralia reports on a dream Adorno had in his period of emigration. Quote, one evening in a mood of helpless sadness, I caught myself using a ridiculously wrong subjunctive form of a verb that was itself not entirely correct. German, but part of the dialect of my native town. I had not heard, let alone used, the endearing misconstruction since my first years at school. Melancholy, drawing me irresistibly into the abyss of childhood, awakened this old, impotently yearning sound in its depths. Language sent back to me like an echo the humiliation which unhappiness had inflicted on me in forgetting what I am. End quote. Adorno. A powerful emotion is stirred up by a weak verb, nor does Adorno look to complex verbal constructions to convey the movement of thought from which the emotional traces of love and desire can be gleaned. Not far from the fragment of Minima Moralia just quoted can we find the remark, quote, to happiness the same applies as to truth. One does not have it, but is in it, end quote. Adorno. The weak verb joins together things that are normally not connected, happiness and knowledge. As an adult intellectual, Adorno attempts to hold fast to the things that the social reality of life threatens to destroy. Quote, the advantage of the infinitesimal freedom that lies in knowledge is such, end quote. The notion of happiness that Adorno owes to his childhood remains visible in even the most highly rarefied extremes of his thought. In his use of language and the particular cadence of the words, we experience the history of exteriorization that, following the idealistic image projected by Goethe and Hegel, will shape the educational history of a humanity made happy. The idea of happiness continues to live off the ahistorical moment of the absence of contradiction. Quote, indeed, happiness is nothing other than being encompassed, an after-image of the original shelter within the mother. But, for this reason, no one who is happy can know that he is so. To see happiness, he would have to pass out of it, to be as if already born. End quote. Adorno. The emigre's memory is ignited by a word in the dialect of his quote, hometown, where Adorno experienced being weaned from the security given by his mother. But the returning exile did not at all see himself as a mama's boy, and instead recalls playing in the cellars of the house in Schöne Aussicht with boys from the rougher Sachsenhausen district with its pubs and street brawls. The Frankfurt dialect did not have only hostile connotations. The family of the local dialect poet, Friedrich Stolze, belonged to the Wiesengrund circle, and Adorno began to learn the piano with Sanna Stolze, the poet's granddaughter. He heard Frankfurt dialect away from home too, in its higher form together with middle and lower class variants, as exemplified by his angry neighbor, Herr Dreibus. Adorno himself spoke the dialect like a native. His parents did not spare their only son, Theodor Ludwig, the experience of primary school. In those days, many affluent families still preferred to employ private tutors to prepare their children at home for the gymnasium. The Wiesengrunds were not among them, but even in Oberrad, the Wiesengrunds did not really belong to the upper crust who could afford such a luxury. They were well aware that they did not live far from the Gerber mill, where Goethe had once spent happy hours, both aesthetic and erotic, with Marianne Willemer. But the Wiesengrund's narrow row house between Grüneleusestrasse and Alfenbacher Landstrasse had been chosen from the point of view of practical convenience. Seeheimer Strasse could not be compared with the childhood villas of Benjamin's Berlin or Horkheimer's Stuttgart. The tension between High German and the class-specific Frankfurt dialect lived on in Adorno's mind in emigration. It must undoubtedly have been a factor in his brief 3 years schooling in the Deutsch Herren Middle School, for even the Dream Notes, where a number of schoolboy memories are recorded, contain references to the Kinder children. Conditions in primary schools toward the end of the Second Empire have become embedded in turn-of-the-century German literature. The image of the teacher as a potential child beater forms an extreme contrast with the childhood world as personified by the loving mother. Quote, the child, the adult Adorno writes, conscious of a somewhat bold generalization, quote, experiences alienation for the first time with a brutal shock. In the development of the individual, the school is virtually the prototype of societal alienation per se, unquote. Adorno. But Teddie may well have found the reality of the Deutsch Herren Middle School less of a test than his time at the head of all his classes in the Kaiser Wilhelm Gymnasium, which was also in Sachsenhausen. The school had adopted modern teaching methods and even accepted new technology, as we can see from his mother's contribution toward the purchase of a new slide projector. Among Adorno's juvenilia, there is an essay that appeared in the Frankfurt School newspaper in 1919. Its tone is remarkably similar to that of his lectures on schooling in the 1960s. In contrast to the literary attacks on teachers from Wedekind to Hesse, he leaps to their defense. Quote, he too, i.e. the teacher, is subject to a purpose that lies beyond himself. For them, the pupils, the teacher is not a human being first of all, but a teacher, i.e. the mediator of abstract coercive information that is indescribable in its origins, and who now has demands to make in the service of this purpose that lies initially beyond the horizon of the pupils, end quote. Adorno. This is the start of Adorno's identification with those who have knowledge from beyond the family circle. What began as a sheltered childhood has now taken cognizance of something else. Adorno attempted to grasp the essence of this development in the image of the heliotrope. The world of his mother is transformed by the arrival of a much-traveled lady. Quote, the cases with the labels from the Souvretta Hotel and Madonna di Campiglio are chests in which the jewels of Aladdin and Ali Baba, wrapped in special tissues, the guest kimonos, are borne hither from the caravanserais of Switzerland and the South Tyrol in sleeping car sedan chairs for his glutted contemplation. And just as fairies talk to children in fairy tales, the visitor talks seriously without condescension to the child of the house. Adorno is not yet embarked on travels of his own to the worldly holiday destinations of the upper middle class, but ideal images that bring far near together appear before his eyes and take a form that might have flowed from the pen of Bloch or Benjamin. Quote, among those nearest him, as their friend, appears the figure of all that is different. The soothsaying gypsy, let in by the front door, is absolved in the lady visitor and transfigured into a rescuing angel. From the joy of greatest proximity, she removes the curse by wedding it to utmost distance. End quote. The 40-plus-year-old Adorno writes of, quote, what is best in childhood, end quote, with an intensity and sadness which equals that of the most impressive pages of Benjamin's book Berlin Childhood, in which we discern the threat of annihilation that hangs over Jewish family life while remaining invisible to a solitary child. Quote, the first, quote, for the guest comes from afar. Her appearance promises the child a world beyond the family, reminding him that it is not the ultimate, unquote. Adorno. These recollections of the past were written in full awareness of the horrors of mass destruction of the European Jews, the lost time, the experience of, quote, that's not what was meant at all, unquote, has gained a further dimension, one that makes even one's own childhood appear in a different light. The utopia of the parental generation, one in which origins should cease to be a crucial factor, can no longer be recreated. What has now become the certainty of, quote, that's not what was meant at all, unquote, provides an interpretation of one's own past. Adorno's reflections on the George Hofmannsthal correspondence, about which he and Benjamin were still exchanging letters as late as 1940, refer to a bygone age, to things past. Hofmannsthal and George began their correspondence on artistic matters at a time when children such as Walter Benjamin and Theodor Wiesengrund were trying to shed light on the secrets of their parents' lives. Walter, who was 11 years older, succeeded in doing so sooner than his younger Frankfurt friend. With clinical incisiveness, Benjamin identified George with the Jugendstil. Quote, in other words, the style in which the old bourgeoisie disguises the premonition of its own impotence by indulging in poetic flights of fancy on a cosmic scale and abusing the word, quote, youth as a magic incantation with which to conjure up intoxicated visions of the future. What is expressed in its formal idiom is the will to evade imminent developments and the presentiments that rise up to confront it. The same may be said of that, quote, spiritual movement that aspired to the renewal of human existence without paying heed to politics. It too amounted to a retrospective transformation of societal contradictions into those hopeless, tragic tensions and convulsions that are so typical of the life of small conventicles, end quote. Benjamin. In the piece, Stefan Gorga in retrospect, in the selected writings. Footnote, quote, here the imperial pretensions are exposed, vulnerable and unprotected, as the pale daydreams of a person suffering from Weltschmerz. This permits a reconciliation with them. Benjamin was probably the first to class George's work with the Jugendstil that is so evident in Melchior Lecter's book Design, end quote. Adorno. The blind alley of bourgeois aestheticism is discussed also in Adorno's retrospective essay of 1940, but it is impossible not to see the fascination he felt for Gorga's dictatorial gestures. Gorga himself had originated from a background in vine cultivation and the wine trade quite close to Frankfurt, but it was a lower-middle-class Catholic milieu that Gorga abandoned as quickly as he could. What Adorno defends in his somewhat affected asceticism is the, quote, utopia of not being oneself, unquote. Adorno. This was a common reaction to the bourgeois realism of his father's generation, in which the children failed to realize that, as Scholem later acknowledged, this realism itself contained a utopian aspect. The memory of this secret of secularized Jewish families was one that Benjamin was able to evoke in his writings better than anyone else. Such secrets live on enigmatically in life forms that are paradoxically Jewish and non-Jewish at the same time. The sadness that Adorno perceived in Benjamin as a, quote, Jewish awareness of the permanence of threat and catastrophe as such, and, quote, was experienced by Benjamin's younger friend with the admixture of a feeling that can only be described as a kind of autobiographical exhibitionism. Quote, to be near him was like being a child at the moment when the door to the room where the Christmas presents lie waiting opens a crack and the abundance of light overwhelms the eye to the point of tears, more moving and more assured than any brightness that greets the child when he is invited to enter. End quote. Adorno. Benjamin's last letter from Paris to Adorno in New York refers to the joy felt at the sight of the table piled high with birthday presents, and Adorno, too, has memories of a child's eyes shining with the reflected light from a room full of Christmas decorations. The Adorno who wrote this passage had already read his Proust. Quote, at 12:30 I would finally make up my mind to enter that house which, like an immense Christmas stocking, seemed ready to bestow on me supernatural delights. The French name Noël was, by the way, unknown to Madame Swann and Gilbert, who had submitted for it the English, quote, Christmas, and had substituted for it the English, quote, Christmas, and would speak of nothing but, quote, Christmas pudding, that people had given them as, quote, Christmas presents, and of going away, the thought of which maddened me with grief, quote, for Christmas, end quote. At home, even I should have thought it degrading to use the word Noël, and always said Christmas, which my father considered extremely silly. End quote. Marcel Proust. In the book Minima Moralia, whenever childhood is recollected, it is always associated with traveling. The suitcases of the aphorism titled, quote, Heliotrope, end quote, had something of the radiance of Adorno's presentiments of a happy adult world. We know today that it was Elsa Herzberger, through whom Adorno was distantly related to Benjamin, who brought these alluring treasures from abroad. Adorno also encounters her at the deathbed of his aunt Agatha, and it was she who gave Adorno the courage to ask for money on behalf of Benjamin, who was destitute in exile in Paris. Few sociologists suspect that a paper Adorno wrote in 1955 about the family was so close to his own personal experience. Quote, the family has demonstrated its strength under extreme conditions and their extended consequences. Their effect on refugees, for example, despite everything, and has in many respects proved to be the engine of life itself, end quote. The friendship between Teddie and Elsa Herzberger came to grief during the emigration, probably because of disagreements about money. Notwithstanding a highly personal attempt at reconciliation on Adorno's part, my dear Elsa, you old rouge, or you old rogue, on 12th of July, 1948, she failed to respond. It seems clear that her lifestyle brought a hint of the luxury of the haute volée into Seeheimerstrasse. Nevertheless, Adorno's first experience of travel had nothing of the grand tour about them. The Wiesengrunds began by looking for places in the neighborhood of Frankfurt. For a while, Neuwalnau in the Taunus competed for their attention with their later favorite, Amorbach. But with the stabilization of the German economy after the First World War and the inflation, Amorbach gained the upper hand. Here, with South German Baroque, they found the direct counterpart to the English modernity, which had held sway over the household in the Heimerstrasse. Teddie was envied for his electric train set. His father knew his way around England, and in comparison with Teddie's English cousins, the Wingfields, he knew all about the latest toys that a modern child ought to have. Teddie evidently came into his own in the holidays, in which even his own home appeared in a new light. Quote, "To a child returning from a holiday, home seems new, fresh, festive. Yet nothing has changed there since he left, only because duty has now been forgotten, of which each piece of furniture, window, lamp was otherwise a reminder, is the house given back the Sabbath peace, and for minutes one is at home in a never-returning world of rooms, nooks, and corridors, in a way that makes the rest of life there a lie. No differently will the world one day appear almost unchanged in its constant feast-day light, when it stands no longer under the lull of labor, and when for homecomers duty has the lightness of holiday play." End quote. Adorno. This fragmentary selection, dating from 1945, affords the reader a glimpse of life in the Heimerstrasse, as if seen through a telescope from California, where this passage was written. What the Adorno legend describes simply as a sheltered childhood is what he thinks as one dominated by bourgeois compulsion to work. But the shift that takes place on Fridays or during the holidays arouses notions of setting things to rights, of the reality of a utopia that is different and more than mere wish fulfillment. When Adorno published his sketches about Amorbach and Sils Maria at a time when he was already famous, the German press responded with a shoulder-shuddering indifference to such seeming lack of discipline. The philosopher as travel writer. 50 years later, these fragments emerge as an individual construct that encompasses an entire social experience, a broken promise of happiness that was evoked in the bourgeois century and then disavowed in the short 20th century of Adorno's life. This experience is woven artfully into the localities of Amorbach and Sils. Quote, "Volkmann, a mountain that is the very image of its name, a friendly giant, now he has long since lain at rest, stretched out broadly over the town that he greets from out of the clouds. Gotthard, the lowest peak in the region, though it bears the name of the mightiest massif of the Central Alps, as if it desired to introduce me gently to mountains while I was still a child." End quote. As if in anticipation of his death in Switzerland in 1966, Adorno reminds his readers of his nostalgia for the Alps. In the same year, on what was to be his last visit to the Alps, Monica Plessner recalls her husband, Helmut, warning his old friend Teddie not to walk too far and to take things slowly. Quote, "Don't worry, I am a mountain person. See you later." End quote. She remembers him calling to the circle of prominent philosophers in front of the Fischerstube as he set out on the climb up the Waldhaus Hotel. But his diary entries from Sils Maria in the same year open up a view of death. Quote, "Anyone who has ever heard the sound made by marmots is unlikely to forget it. To say it is a whistle is to say too little. It sounds mechanical, as if steam-driven, and alarming for that reason. The fear that these little animals must have felt since time immemorial has frozen in their throats into a sort of warning sound. The sound that should act as a protection has lost its lifelike expressiveness. Stricken by panic, they have mimicked death itself. If I am not mistaken, they have receded further and further into the mountains over the last 12 years as camping has made ever deeper inroads. Even the whistling sounds with which they uncomplainingly accuse the friends of nature are heard more rarely. Their lack of expression is matched by that of the landscape. That confers on it the pathos of distance that Nietzsche, who took refuge there, talked about. At the same time, the moraines that are typical of the landscape resembled industrial tips, mining slag heaps. But the scars of civilization and the untouched regions beyond the tree line give the lie to the idea of nature as a solace, something that gives man a warm feeling. One second. I like that word slag heap, so I want to jot that down. Both the scars... Sorry, where am I at now? They reveal what the cosmos is really like. The conventional image of nature is limited, of a bourgeois narrowness, confined to the tiny zone in which the life familiar to us from history thrives. The path is the philosophy of culture, where the domination of nature destroys that animated but deceptive imago. It seems to approach the transcendent sadness of space. The unvarnished truth of the landscape of the Engadine is superior to that of the petty bourgeoisie, but this is more than made up for by its imperialism, its complicity with death. End quote. Adorno. It is as if the lifelong themes of critical theory all come together once again at this point. The use of political and sociological terms to describe the landscape may seem inappropriate, but Adorno wished to achieve precisely this effect. It touches on idiosyncrasies that can be achieved with a minimal change of focus. Quote, imperialism here turns into the experience of boundless expansion, which, however, contains a utopian aspect that is at odds with the death threat represented by the social system as a whole. His reflection on the marmots whistling evokes the childhood feeling of a non-violent boundlessness, the no man's land close to Amerbach. Quote, the frontier between Baden and Bavaria ran between Otterfzell and Ernstthal. It was marked by posts on the highway with imposing coats of arms in the provincial colors spiraling around the posts, blue and white on the one side. If I remember right, and red and yellow on the other, there was a generous space between the two. That was where I liked to walk on the pretext, which I did not actually believe, that this empty space belonged to neither of the two states, that it was free, and that I could hold sway there as I wished. I did not mean this seriously, but that did not diminish my pleasure. In reality, what I probably liked were the state colors whose limits I felt I had escaped. I had a similar feeling in exhibitions like the ILA, bracket, the International Aerospace Exhibition, end bracket, at the sight of the countless flags that fluttered in harmony next to one another. The feeling of the International was familiar to me from home and also from my parents' guests, from whom I heard names like Ferrino and Sidney Clifton Hall. That International was no centralized state. The peace it promised was brought about by the festive assemblage of different things, the colorfulness of the flags and the innocent frontier markings which, as I was not a little astonished to discover, brought about no change in the landscape. The land they enclosed, however, and which I myself occupied, was a no man's land. Later during the war this word came to be used for the devastated space between the two fronts, but it is the faithful translation of the Greek Aristophanic word that I understood at the time all the better, the less I knew of it. Utopia, end quote. Adorno. Adorno's parents' house in Seeheimerstrasse in Oberrad implanted this promise of happiness in Adorno, their only child, but not just in him. The memory of this particular place recurs also in a letter of the 28th of March 1941, written by Adorno's oldest friend, Siegfried Krakauer, in the face of the historic catastrophe, and after violent personal disagreements. Quote, I am so delighted to see you. The more time passes, the closer I feel to Seeheimerstrasse. Nothing can change that anymore. End quote. As Adorno recollected in 1964, quote, for years Krakauer, end quote, who was 14 years the elder, quote, read the Critique of Pure Reason with me regularly on Saturday afternoons, end quote. In later years, the name of Kant always acts as a reminder of what German history has failed to make good. Quote, his thought is centered upon the concept of autonomy, the self-responsibility of the reasoning individual, instead of upon those blind dependencies which include the unreflected supremacy of the national. According to Kant, the universal of reason realizes itself only in the individual. End quote. Adorno. Adorno's relationship with his parents' house almost always embodies his relation to tradition, but in the German Jewish history of the 20th century, this always refers to the rift, or rather the rifts, whose presence in that history cannot be denied. The relationship between tradition and experience is described as precarious in Adorno's essay titled Piano Duets once again. The same may be said of the piece Words Without Songs, which were written not long before in 1931 and which have appeared in the collected works under the heading Miscellaneous. They too reveal something specific about Adorno's experience in childhood. In fact, Adorno actually said as much to Krakauer, the literary editor of the Frankfurter Zeitung, to whom he had submitted them for publication. The exception of a trusted friend, the secret of this paradox is not simply an individual matter. The pattern of experience reminds us right down to the choice of individual words of Georg Simmel, whom Krakauer knew well personally. Simmel's Sociology of the Stranger, which had a seminal influence posthumously on the Chicago School of Sociology, generalizes the secular experience of the Jews of Central Europe to the point of unrecognizability. They are converted into guests who, in accordance with the succinct formula of Simmel's, come today and stay tomorrow. Simmel's theory is expressed in universal terms, but it is easy to identify the specific experience underlying it. The vague universality of Simmel's ideas on strangers makes it a simple matter to transfer them to the relations between natives and immigrants. But his ideas can also be thought of as bearing the marks of the end of the long bourgeois century. The guest disrupts the unity of domestic existence. He reminds people of their own nomadic past. The Orientalism fad of the late 19th century transformed this memory into a phantasmagoria. The child ceases to experience his house as a, quote, mighty fortress. It now comes to feel like an oasis or a caravanserai. With the guest, strangeness can be perceived in oneself. According to Hegel, this is the beginning of history. The bourgeois lifestyle of the end of the 19th century denies tradition by inventing tradition. The discovery of Jugendstil, which Benjamin so accurately described, led with a certain time lag to that of Baroque, the misuse of which Adorno never ceased to castigate. The confusion of Baroque and Neo-Baroque elements was part of the cityscape of Frankfurt that Adorno had before his eyes from childhood on. This included the famous Old Bridge, which had stood in front of the house in Schöne Aussicht before it was torn down to make way for a more modern one when Teddie was still a child. It also included the Neo-Baroque style of the university, which was built in 1914, but whose Neo-Baroque ornamentations were removed by the architect Ferdinand Kramer on the instructions of Rector Max Horkheimer during renovations after 1950. From the very opening of his novel, Ginster, Siegfried Kracauer flirts with linguistic tropes which Zimmel also reveled in. The relationship of the chief character, Ginster, to his hometown is summed up in the lapidary formulation, quote, "Since, moreover, he grew up in F, he knew less about it than about other towns he had never visited," end quote. The yearning for a, quote, second home must have been great for both Wiesengrund-Adorno and Kracauer. Kracauer felt drawn to Paris, Adorno to Vienna. Adorno remembers the beginning of their friendship as the result of a family arrangement. Quote, "I was a student at the gymnasium when I met him near the end of the First World War. A friend of our parents, Rosie Stern, had invited the two of us to their house. She was a tutor at the Philanthropium, where Krakauer's uncle, the historiographer of the Frankfurt Jews, was a member of the faculty. As was probably our hostess' intention, an intensive contact sprang up between us. End quote. The guest who now became a frequent visitor in Seeheimerstrasse was both like Adorno and somehow different. Quote, "To me, Krakauer seemed, although not at all sentimental, a man with no skin, as though everything external attacked his defenseless interior, as though he could defend himself only by giving voice to his vulnerability. He had had a difficult time in his childhood in more than one regard. As a pupil in the Klinger Upper School, he had also suffered anti-Semitism, something quite unusual in the commercial city of Frankfurt, and a sort of joylessness hovered over his own milieu, despite its humane scholarly tradition." End quote. Adorno. Krakauer's lower-middle-class background contrasted sharply with the parvenu cultivation of the Wiesengrund-Adorno family in Oberrad, a background which threatened, however, to isolate Teddie, its infant prodigy. It is obvious that Adorno's childhood was marked by a deep need for friendship. Krakauer, 14 years older, opened up new vistas for him. The first phase of their friendship coincided with one of Krakauer's first publications. It appeared in the journal Logos in 1917-1918. The reader can clearly see the influence of the last years of the German Empire, as well as an echo of neo-Kantianism and pre-psychoanalytic psychology. In addition, one can discern the witty and elegant style of Georg Simmel, a thinker whom Krakauer greatly admired, but against whom he rebelled intellectually in the 1920s. Quote, "People truly bound together in friendship are united by an original bond of affection that is not founded on intellectual agreement, but is seldom without an element of sensual pleasure, which is stimulated by the mere fact of being together. Where this is absent, no friendship will arise, however many emotional points of contact may be present." End quote. Beneath the artificially smooth phrases, entirely in the spirit of the fin de siecle, I don't know how to say that word, Krakauer's text reveals the feeling that paradoxically provoked profound irritation in his friendship with Adorno. Like Adorno, Krakauer had remained behind in America. Unlike Adorno, Krakauer had remained behind in America. But even Adorno's late writings from the 1960s on are unable to conceal his idiosyncratic reactions to their disagreements. It was simply a, quote, "troubled friendship," end quote, as Martin J. succinctly summed it up in a little-known but informative study. As early as Krakauer's essay on friendship of 1917-18, we can see how resemblances and differences prove to be the source of disagreement. Quote, "Even friends develop in different directions. The only condition of their friendship is that they should come together in all their essential principles and ideals, and that they should go forward together in enhancing their potential." End quote. Krakauer. The end of Krakauer's essay contains a utopian vision of friendship that reminds us of the essay Adorno would write some 40 years later with its idea of, quote, a family born of freedom, end quote. Krakauer sums up the essence of his view of friendship as follows, quote, it is an ideal, principled community of free, independent individuals founded on the joint development of their typical potential, to develop together without losing one another, to give oneself so as to possess a larger version of oneself, to merge into oneness and yet to continue to exist separately for oneself. That is the secret of friendship, end quote. Krakauer. Adorno's friendship with Krakauer frequently suffered blows to the stability that Krakauer saw as the essential condition of a successful friendship. Quote, if, however, one friend, unlike the other, has reached a certain stage in the development of his potential, he must unconsciously make use of the energy released by his newly gained self-confidence, while the friend who has lagged behind succumbs to an influence, having nothing comparable to act as a counterweight. As he gropes his way, he feels humiliated, violated, and hampered at every step. Resentment takes possession of him. Against his will, his friend's actions, thoughts, and value judgments invade his mind, and thrust aside his own fumbling initiatives. His instincts waver, his soul becomes dependent, feelings of impotence and weakness ensue. For his part, the friend has no choice but to continue to follow his own nature. Every attempt to mend the situation artificially would merely distort it the more. Only a resolute temporary breach can bring redemption. End quote. Krakauer. With this word, quote, redemption, Adorno concludes his essay titled The Curious Realist of 1964 of his now famous reintroduction of Krakauer to the German public. The memoir of Krakauer also sheds light on childhood, Adorno's as well as Krakauer's. Quote, Freud's idea that the decisive points in the genesis of the individual occur during childhood is certainly true of the intelligible character. The childhood imago survives in the futile and compensatory determination to be a real adult. End quote. Adorno. The intellectual difference between Adorno and Krakauer can be pinpointed by looking at their childhoods. Quote, Krakauer's experiential stance remained that of the foreigner, transposed into the realm of spirit. Krakauer thinks as though he had transformed the childhood trauma of problematic belongingness into a mode of vision for and familiar, which everything appears as it would on a journey, and even what is gray and familiar becomes a colorful object of amazement. End quote. Adorno. Nevertheless, Krakauer's entrance into the apparently secure family environment of the Adorno Wiesengrunds brought a destabilizing factor with it, that of a, quote, problematic sense of belongingness, end quote. Adorno. For Krakauer, yearning for friendship meant the hope of a home that could not be put in question. Quote, we wish to have a home and to be a home for others. These needs complement each other like breathing in and out. End quote. Krakauer. Krakauer's own character, which Adorno associates with his childhood trauma, coincides with the experience of a, quote, newly emerged type of intellectual, end quote. One for which Scheler and Zimmel, for example, had formulated the modes of a new way of living and thinking in advance. The Jewish origin of these intellectuals acquires a determining role by its very absence. The Jewish tradition no longer seemed viable to them, but it left unmistakable traces in the way that they experienced life. The 14-year age difference between Krakauer and Adorno marks a threshold. An only child, Krakauer had been born in Frankfurt in 1889. In his generation, the break with the Jewish tradition of the large family was abrupt. His grandparents on his mother's side were already living in Frankfurt and had 5 daughters and 2 sons. The eldest daughter, Hedwig Oppenheim, married Isidor Krakauer in the 1880s. Her younger sister, Rosetta, married his brother Adolf, who was 3 years his senior. Adolf had entered the practical profession of textile salesman so as to enable his younger brother to become a rabbi. The Krakauers came originally from Silesia, a center at of the textile industry in Central Europe. As a traveling salesman, Siegfried's father commuted between Paris and Krakow. Isidor, the younger brother, studied first at the theological seminary in Breslau, now Wroclaw, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and subsequently he took classics, philology, history, geography, and German at the university. After graduating, he attained a position as history teacher at the Philanthropium in Frankfurt, a Jewish Realschule with a reputation for liberalism. It belonged to the Jewish community but was also attended by non-Jews. In 1885, Siegfried's aunt and uncle took over the running of the, quote, Julius und Amalie Verscheinsche Stiftung, a boarding school for poor, orphaned, or semi-orphaned Jewish children at Pfingstweidstrasse 14. As an only child, Siegfried liked spending time in the Ostend district of Frankfurt, as can be seen from the diaries that he began writing during his childhood. From 1898 to 1904, he attended the Philanthropium, and from 1904 to 1907, the Klinger Oberrealschule in Hermesweg. His father and his uncle died in 1918 and 1923, respectively. Krakauer lived with his mother and his aunt in the Nordend district. His career as a correspondent for the Frankfurter Zeitung led him into exile in Paris via Berlin. His sisters, with whom he had shared the apartment at Sternstrasse 29, remained behind and were deported to Theresienstadt in 1942. Sorry. Where am I? Quote, in retrospect, it seems to me that for all the friendliness I was shown, the catastrophe that befell his mother and her sister, who seemed to have an influence over him in extreme old age, had long been anticipated in the atmosphere of the Krakauer home. End quote. Adorno. A sentence like this, of which there are a number in Adorno's writings on Krakow from the 1960s, relives the differences that were the cause of painful irritations. The lower middle-class Jewish atmosphere must have disconcerted the self-assured and good-looking youth who seems to have attracted Krakauer for more reasons than one. Siegfried Krakauer wrote in a finely chiseled style, but he had suffered from a speech defect from childhood, and his schoolmates teased him on account of his appearance. Krakauer defended himself after his own fashion. Like the teachers, he kept a little red notebook in which he recorded his treatment at the hands of his fellows. Quote, with him, many things were reactive. Philosophy was in no small measure a medium of self-assertion. End quote. Adorno. Adorno seems to have wanted to show in retrospect that he, who had been the significantly younger man, had now left his friend behind. As repeated reference to Krakauer's closeness to Simmel and Scheller, Adorno highlights the generation gap to which Krakauer would never admit throughout his life. In the late text of Krakauer, not just in the in the late text on Krakauer, not just in the Curious Realist, but also in his obituary for Krakauer 3 years later, Adorno stresses just how much further he had advanced. There was no common source shared by the two of them. In retrospect, their former closeness is depicted with a gesture of superiority. Adorno's view distorts the reality, but posterity will thank him for providing a more perceptive insight into the feelings of authors who were so resistant to biographical probing. He would certainly have had to concede that his older friend had been the first to recognize, quote, the sinister implications of the fad for biography, end quote. Adorno. The difference in their ages conceals other differences that are even more significant, and indeed could scarcely be greater between two young friends. On the one hand, the adored prodigy from a good middle-class family; on the other, a solitary, ugly boy born into straitened family circumstances and unable to find suitable companions. The persistence of visible Jewish traits in the Krakauers, even though they had cast off the religious tradition, must have perplexed the young Wiesengrund, who had grown up with the conviction that one's origins were a matter of chance. The strange title of his later appreciation of Krakauer, The Curious Realist, points to this. We can still sense his mood in the perceptive remark about the way in which, quote, Krakauer's adaptive strategy, and quote, which always had, quote, cunning in it, a will to be done with what was inimical and powerful, unquote, had been, quote, smuggled into his theory of film. Adorno quotes Krakauer's own words, quote, all these characters seem to yield to the powers that be and yet manage to outlast them, end quote. Much earlier in his piece Travel Pictures, Heinrich Heine had already commented on this art of, quote, outlasting as a Jewish survival technique in a modern but only imperfectly secularized world. Much in the essay on Krakauer reminds us of Adorno's Travel Pictures, above all, quote, the primacy of the optical, quote, which Adorno identifies in Krakauer's thought, and also the idea of traveling as a way of distancing oneself from everyday experience. Adorno is still close enough to get under the skin of an intellectual non-Jewish Jew, but he is also too close not to react with unusual strength of feeling to the pressure of a trauma to which he had not been exposed in his own childhood. Episodes from school are an integral part of the repertoire of memoirs, especially of Jewish German memoirs. Heinrich Heine's memoirs, which is the title of the memoirs is Memoirs, for example, play ironically with the new genre of autobiographies of famous people. They contain a passage that parodies the relationship between origins and childhood experience. Goethe's idealizing depiction of his ancestors in the book Poetry and Truth supplies the foil to Heine's text. Quote, my father was monosyllabic by nature, spoke rarely. Let me repeat that. Goethe's idealizing depiction of his ancestors in Poetry and Truth supplies the foil to Heine's text. Quote, my father was monosyllabic by nature, rarely spoke, and once, when I was still small at a time when I spent my weekdays in the dreary Franciscan school and my Sundays at home, I took the opportunity to ask my father who my grandfather had been. He replied to my question half laughing, half crossly, quote, your grandfather was a little Jew with a big beard, end quote. The next day, when I arrived at school, where I found my little classmates already assembled, I hastened to tell the important news that my grandfather was a little Jew who had a long beard. Scarcely had I finished telling them than this news flew from one pair of lips to the next and was repeated in every key, accompanied by a variety of animal imitations. The children leaped over tables and benches, tore the maths tables from the walls so that they flew to the floor alongside the inkwells, and all the while the children laughed, bleated, grunted, barked, and crowed, creating an unholy din whose constant refrain was my grandfather, who was a little Jew with a long beard. The teacher responsible for the class heard the noise and entered the room red in the face with fury and demanded to know who had started this riot. As always in such cases, everyone went quiet and tried to shift the blame, with the result that poor little me was convicted of having started the entire rumpus, and I atoned for my guilt with a severe thrashing. End quote. Heine. Erich Pfeiffer Belli, a boy from an upper-middle-class family in Frankfurt, reports a similarly credible incident from Adorno's school days. In the playground of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gymnasium, now the Freiherr vom Stein School, he remembers Adorno as the, quote, much admired but also rather envied, and, quote, top boy. Quote, at home he was called Teddie, and his nickname had somehow become known in the gymnasium. The playground, lined with young trees, was dusty and without shade. In the breaks, the older boys used to promenade around in circle, while we younger ones rampaged around playing our games. Teddie had a few regular friends who, like him, had not noticed that some energy or other had pinned a notice to his back with the word, quote, Teddie, in large letters on it. In a trice, a howling mob started to chase him. At the time, Teddie was a rather slender, shy boy who did not actually understand what was going on. End quote. Eric Pfeiffer Belly. Rather casually written memoirs like these need to be taken with a grain of salt. Even the age difference between the two is not accurate. Born in 1901, Pfeiffer Belly was 2 years older than Adorno, but the atmosphere described seems to fit the precocious Adorno well enough and to capture the ambivalence with which he was regarded. In 1987, Pfeiffer Belly seems unable to tell the story without commentary. Quote, "We all knew that Teddie was Jewish. The scene in the playground was no anti-Semitic demonstration. It arose from his singularity. The fact that in every class he put everyone else in the shade. It was a stupid schoolboy's prank, nothing more." End quote. Pfeiffer Belly. That sounds a bit too good to be true. Freud's warning about the lack of truth in autobiographies may be extended to the feeling of many Jewish high school pupils in what was still the imperial city of Frankfurt, for whom the tensions that might be associated with anti-Semitism were more or less undetectable. Even with hindsight, however, and in full knowledge of the genocide of the European Jews at the hands of German National Socialists, we see that statements about anti-Semitism in the Weimar Republic are often highly contradictory. Adorno repeatedly returns to this topic after 1938, ending up by developing a theory that what made Auschwitz possible was not hatred but coldness. What made Auschwitz possible was not hatred but coldness. References to bullying in the school playground as a form of socialization turn up too frequently in Adorno's writings to allow us to describe his experiences there and on the way to school in all too innocuous terms. Pfeiffer Belly included himself, as Reinhard Papp's researchers have shown, in what was called the, quote, harmless club, consisting of 5 insolent boys who proudly posed for photographs. Some of them thought it was a good joke to waylay, quote, Teddie Wiesengrund, quote, on his way to school and shout, quote, greetings to Father Abraham, unquote, from some hiding place or other. These boys were indifferent to the fact that Teddie's mother was a Catholic and that he himself had been confirmed as a Protestant, thanks to a parson he had found intellectually stimulating. It did not stop them from bequeathing to him, quote, the nightmare of childhood, unquote. Peter von Haselberg's amusing account of Teddie's 2 mothers may have overlooked the fact that it was not simply because of Teddie's defective sense of, quote, sportsmanship that 2 adults accompanied him on his daily journey was Oberrat to Heinrichstrasse, where the Kaiser Wilhelm Gymnasium was located. Quote, I remember hearing how upset the 2 ladies were about some harsh treatment the sensitive boy had received at the hands of his father, and on top of that there was the mockery of acquaintances from Offenbach, who thought it was highly amusing to see the 2 women board the number 16 tram with Teddie and to stay on the lookout to make sure that nothing untoward happened to him. End quote. In Mini Memoralia, Adorno included a section titled The Bad Comrade, which he dated 1935, 10 years earlier than the other reflections. He tells there of the, quote, 5 patriots who set up a single schoolfellow, thrashed him, and, when he complained to the teacher, defamed him as a traitor to the class, end quote. With hindsight, Adorno sees in these boys the precursors of the Third Reich, the outbreak of which did indeed take his, quote, political judgment, end quote, by surprise, but not his, quote, unconscious fear, end quote. An event like this brings his experience much closer to Krakauer's than the Adorno of the 1960s would like to think. Quote, so closely had all the motifs of permanent catastrophe brushed me, so deeply were the warning signs of the German awakening burned into me, that I recognized them all in the features of Hitler's dictatorship, and it often seemed to my foolish terror as if the total state had been invented expressly against me, to inflict on me all those things from which in my childhood, its primeval form, I had been temporarily dispensed. Adorno's recollection from the year 1935 is enacted in an intermediate space between dream and reality, and this is reflected by the large number of subjunctives in this text. Despite these, the reader does gain a sense of the bad comrades of his school days, of those, quote, whose hallooing knew no bounds when the top boy blundered, who could not put together a correct sentence but found all of mine too long, end quote. Adorno. Even after Adorno had established himself as a professor, the memory of his childhood of his school experiences continued to rankle. His interpretation of the, quote, taboos on the teaching profession, quote, focuses on attitudes towards intellectual labor. Quote, the ambivalence toward the knowledgeable person is archaic, end quote. It is remarkable how often the word, quote, resentment recurs, which we have already encountered in his story about Herr Drybus, his neighbor. Quote, out of resentment, illiterates consider educated people to be insignificant as soon as the latter confront them with any kind of authority, but without, like the higher clergy, assuming an elevated social status and exercising social power. The teacher is heir to the monk. The teacher is heir to the monk. The odium or the ambiguity associated with the monk's vocation was transferred to the teacher after the monks had largely lost their function, end quote. Adorno. This ambivalent attitude toward teachers is compounded by their disciplinary powers. It is no doubt the case that the school tyrant with his cane at the ready had already become something of a rarity even in Adorno's own childhood, but as a, quote, last memory trace, and, quote, it had still not been finally eradicated from West German schools in the mid-1960s. Quote, the reverse image of this ambivalence is the magical veneration in which teachers are held in many countries, as once in China, and in many groups, for example, among devout Jews. The magical aspect of this attitude towards teachers seems to be stronger wherever the vocation of a teacher is bound up with religious authority, whereas the negative association goes with the decline of such authority. End quote, Adorno. The emphatic concept of German idealism continued to feed off this spirit. Helmut Plessner, who had been born in Wiesbaden in 1892, was a philosopher of sociology whose path frequently crossed that of the Frankfurt critical theorists. It was he who coined the fitting expression, quote, world piety, to sum up the idealized form of life of the educated German middle classes. The literature of protest against the authoritarian school to which the young Wiesengrund did not wish simply to subscribe throve on the contradiction between the ideals of humanist education and the everyday reality of school. The celebrated Goethe Gymnasium, like the Kaiser Wilhelm Gymnasium, which were both easily accessible from Oberrad, and which only opened in 1914, were both considered to be reformed schools to which Jewish parents preferred to send their children instead of to the strongholds of traditional education. But because of the rapid developments in technology and industry, the humanist education of the gymnasium already seemed more than a little stale. The goals of education based on classical German literature seemed to have been undermined, even though the cultured middle classes were still deeply attached to them. By around 1910, a cliched notion of personality had already taken the place of the theory of the education of mankind, of which Adorno reminds his readers in his Gloss on Personality of 1966, with a quotation with Wilhelm von Humboldt, quote, merely because both his thought and his actions are possible only by virtue of a third thing, only by virtue of the representation and elaboration of something, of which the authentic distinguishing trait is that it is not man, i.e., is world. Man tries to grasp as much world as possible and to join it with himself as closely as he can. End quote. Adorno. There's a footnote that I missed. It says, Helmut Plessner stood in for Adorno in the Frankfurt Institute when the latter had to return temporarily to the United States in 1952 and was always more or less in competition with him in the German Sociology Association. While in emigration in Holland, he had written a wonderful essay for his Dutch students in 1935 with the title Destiny of the German Spirit at the End of the Bourgeois Age. This was then published in 1958 with a preface. It appeared in Germany under the title Die Verspätete Nation. The Belated Nation. End footnote. In Adorno's childhood, the validity of the traditional educational values of the German middle classes appeared to be self-evident in both the family and school. In his juvenilia, and also in Krakauer's essays in the early 1920s, we still encounter the cult of personality of the late bourgeoisie, which Adorno subsequently wanted to see banished to the quote, speeches around 1910, end quote. Nevertheless, in his matriculation essay of Easter 1921, we still find him concluding, quote, "To shape the world within the self is the meaning of life. Only by giving shape to the world does the self become a personality," end quote. Adorno. As we can see from Krakauer's writings, the old powers of the educated middle class had not yet been overthrown by 1920, although they had been gravely undermined. In the essay Adorno wrote in 1958 describing his memories of his schoolteacher Reinhold Sickel, he dates the downfall of the, quote, "liberal assumptions about culture under which I had grown up," end quote, to the period just before he left school. At any rate, it is abundantly clear that Krakauer's writings around this time revolve frequently around this question of lost meaning. As late as 1915, Krakauer's essay titled "The Experience of War" is contrasted with everyday middle-class life. As with his famous models, Scheller and Zimmel, the war represented a challenge to reformulate his criticism of the lost meaning arising from the process of secularization. Quote, "The life of the majority was enacted in a world of stale social conventions and professions. As the only super-individual institutions, they made certain goals and possibilities for development available. If one were to leave this realm, one would find oneself in a vacuum. There was little otherwise to bind men together, and not only to bind them together, but also to stimulate their loftiest ideals. Politics frequently repelled people as being too petty and was pursued only by a minority. Art likewise satisfied only individual, self-contained parts of the soul. Above all, the most important needs of the soul, its religious needs, lay fallow. There was no active, universally binding faith that was appropriate to our natures, and that might have purified and sanctified them, end quote. At the time, Krakauer was an enthusiastic supporter of the war, but he nevertheless separated the needs of, quote, aesthetic human beings from general experience. The needs were defined for him by what Thomas Mann called, quote, the feeling of isolation, quote. Such a person finds, quote, redemption in the war. Quote, by sinking into the mass and the renunciation of individuality, the soul receives the gift of immediate life, end quote. End quote. And that quote is from Siegfried Krakauer. At the time, Krakauer was an enthusiastic supporter of the war, but he nevertheless separated the... Where the hell am I already read that. Against this background, Krakauer's essays on friendship of 1920 and 1921 can be read in a different light. The unequal friendship with Adorno was preceded by a yearning for friendship that survived the disappointments of the war. According to Krakauer, friendship was supposed to compensate for the inadequacies of bourgeois life. Relationships, quote, above all between men whose actions aspire to fulfill their typical dispositions in realms in which they can strive unceasingly for universal goals and in which one can feel at home only if one commits oneself within one's entire being. Artists and complete human beings of every kind are the relevant people here, end quote. Adorno. Krakauer. Excuse me. Here, too, we can feel almost physically the unresolved attitudes of the fin de siècle, turn of the century, that underpin Krakauer's feelings of friendship for the schoolboy Wiesengrund-Adorno, quote, people of very unequal ages, end quote. Quote, their relationship is a very different meaning for the feelings of each of the participants, but it is at least based on common experience and the blissful sense of equal aspirations. A young man just developing looks to his friends for confirmation of his plans, his spiritual nature. He relies on his older friend, even when he contradicts him, since his inner essence to expand has as yet gone unchecked. He likes the feeling that he is encountering definite limits, still more or less inhibited. He does not really judge the relationship. He speaks his mind freely, expresses his views in lengthy monologues without being able to ask the older man for true reciprocity. He demands to be the center of attention and often takes just when he thinks he is giving, and gives generously when he is most demanding. A sense of shame forbids him from becoming overconscious of the older man. End quote. Krakauer. In his friendships, Krakauer appears to have been attracted by people different from himself, artists, quote, complete human beings, and people of a very different age group. Thomas Mann's Tonio Kruger, which I guess is a book, was much in the minds of all young people around 1910. Krakauer's later novels, Ginster and Georg, are virtuoso variations on the way friends see things differently. His own real-life friendships with Max Flesch, Julius Henschel, and Otto Heinebach, the top boy in the Goethe Gymnasium who fell in the trenches of 1916, are transformed by Krakauer into literary constellations. These friendships contain a utopian dimension that is not immune to disappointments. They open up the possibility of life beyond the family, something we can find echoed in Adorno's memory of his school friend Erich. Quote, when my friend Eric and I took some delight in using foreign words at the gymnasium, we were acting as though we were already the bee's knees. It would be difficult to determine now whether this behavior preceded the rancoon or not. Certainly the two went together very well, unquote. Just as with the beginnings of the friendship with Krakauer, however, Adorno was able to indulge in a provocative behavior as a schoolboy because he enjoyed the security of the Wiesengrund family tradition. Quote, I will not deny that I sometimes followed the bad example of an elderly great-aunt. As a child, according to the family history, she had looked up the French word for, quote, kneading through, end quote, in her French dictionary, and then asked her poor tutor for it. When he had no answer, she responded scornfully, tisk tisk, la houche, or la houche. I don't know what the hell that means, end quote. Adorno. Leo Löwenthal, who had got to know Adorno at the age of 18 through Krakauer, also refers to Adorno's home background. Quote, it was an existence you just had to love. If you were not dying of jealousy of this protected, beautiful life, and in it Adorno had gained the confidence that never left him his entire life, end quote. Löwenthal. The comparison makes it quite clear. The atmosphere of the parental home distinguishes the Seeheimerstrasse from Krakauer's life at home, but also from Benjamin's or Horkheimer's family backgrounds. Adorno himself kept thinking up new epithets from the plant world, such as heliotrope and, quote, hothouse plant, end quote, to describe his childhood and the particular legacy of his home background. Mysteriously, work and economics somehow lay out of sight, beyond the child's horizon, not unlike the situation with Benjamin, the son of a rentier. Quote, in early childhood I saw the first snow shovelers in thin shabby clothes. Asking about them, I was told they were men without work who were given this job so that they could earn their bread. Then they get what they deserve, having to shovel snow. I cried out in rage, bursting uncontrollably into tears, end quote. The contradictions, and that quote is from Benjamin. No, Adorno. The contradictions of bourgeois existence are experienced from outside. Right down to his very last lectures, Adorno sustained the theme that alongside the legitimate criticism of the illusory nature of culture, we should not forget its civilizing influence. Quote, culture not only represses nature but conserves nature through its repression. This resonates in the concept of culture, which originates in agriculture. Life has been perpetuated through culture, along with the idea of a decent life, end quote. Adorno. In the market gardening environment of Oberrad, where both Krakauer and Löwenthal visited their younger friend, a secularized cultural utopia seemed to be a genuine possibility. Quote, tradition in a strict sense is incompatible with bourgeois society, end quote. Adorno. Oscar Wiesengrund had established a bourgeois family and, apart from what was required professionally, had turned his back on the Jewish tradition. In this respect, he was not unlike Leo Löwenthal's father, although as a doctor in Bockenheim, the latter found it much harder to make ends meet. For Leo Löwenthal, despite his parents' strictly secular lifestyle, Jewishness remained a living reality, and the difference between his father's enlightened liberalism and his siblings' religiosity appears to have been simply a matter of choice. Krakauer had described Löwenthal and himself as, quote, hybrids, caught between traditional Jewishness and a secularized present. Unlike Buber and Scholem, they were unable to find their way back to the Jewish religion, however constituted. Thanks to his youth, Wiesengrund-Adorno appeared to his older friend to have been exempted from the need to face up to this conflict. On the 4th of December 1921, Krakauer wrote to Löwenthal, quote, something incomparable puts him in a position over both of us, ... An admirable material existence, and a wonderfully self-confident character, ... He truly is a beautiful specimen of a human being, even if I am not without some skepticism concerning his future. I'm surely delighted by him in the present, end quote. Krakauer, 1921. And that's from the No. Who said that? Yeah, that's Krakauer. But I guess that letter of that's being cited is from Löwenthal's book, An Unmastered Past. And that's the end of Chapter 2 of Theodor W. Adorno, One Last Genius by Detlev Claussen. Thank you so much for listening.